Not every prison is built with stone. Some are built from good intentions, from promises we make to the people we love, from sleepless nights spent trying to prevent tomorrow's pain, and from the quiet belief that if we are careful enough, wise enough, strong enough, life will finally stop surprising us. There was once a man who believed exactly that. For nearly his entire life, he tried to control a river. Not because he hated it, quite the opposite. He loved everything the river touched. It watered the fields that fed his village. It gave thirsty children something to drink on hot summer afternoons. It carried fishermen safely home before nightfall. It reflected the faces of those he loved more clearly than any mirror ever could. He believed that if he could control the river, he could protect everything else. At first, the villagers admired him. They called him responsible, thoughtful, dependable, the kind of man every family hoped to have nearby when difficult times arrived. Years later, those same people would stand quietly along the riverbank, watching him with sadness instead of admiration. Not because he had failed, but because they could see something he no longer could. The river was still flowing. The seasons were still changing. The birds were still singing each morning. Only one thing had slowly disappeared: his peace. Perhaps that sounds familiar. Not because you have ever tried to control a river. Very few people have. But perhaps you have tried to control an outcome, a conversation, a relationship, a future that had not yet arrived. Perhaps you have carried responsibilities so faithfully that, somewhere along the way, you forgot what it felt like to simply breathe. If that is true, then I have a feeling this story found you for a reason. Tonight, I am not going to ask you to solve anything. I'm not going to tell you to stop worrying. The human heart has never changed simply because someone told it to. Instead, I want to invite you to walk beside an ancient river, to meet a young boy whose greatest strength would slowly become his greatest burden, and to discover the lesson that the river spent a lifetime trying to teach him. As you listen, you may find yourself remembering someone. Perhaps a parent who carried too much, a friend who always tried to fix everyone else's problems. Or perhaps you will quietly recognize yourself. If one memory gently rises to the surface while you listen tonight, do not push it away. Simply let it sit beside you, as peacefully as a leaf resting upon the water. Many people will hear this story before they fall asleep. Each of them will carry away a different lesson. I wonder, which one will choose you? Come with me now. The night is calm. The stars have begun to appear above a quiet valley hidden among distant mountains. An old river is making its endless journey toward the sea, completely unaware that one small boy is standing on its shore for the very first time. The boy did not know that this ordinary evening would be remembered for the rest of his life. To him, it was simply another walk beside the river. The air carried the comforting scent of cedar and damp earth after a warm afternoon. Fireflies had already begun their quiet dance among the tall grasses, while the last golden light rested gently upon the surface of the water. His father walked a few steps ahead, carrying an empty fishing basket over one shoulder. Neither of them felt any need to hurry. The river had its own pace. So did they. For a long while, they spoke only through the small sounds that families understand without words. The crunch of footsteps along the path. The soft splash of a fish somewhere beyond the reeds. The evening breeze moving through the willow branches. Sometimes the deepest love is found in silence rather than conversation. When they reached a smooth stretch of shoreline, his father stopped walking. He set the basket down and gazed across the water as though greeting an old friend. The boy stood beside him. "What are we waiting for?" he asked. His father smiled without taking his eyes from the river. The river. The answer seemed strange. "It is already here." His father nodded. "Yes, but it is always arriving." The boy looked down at the water, puzzled. It seemed impossible. The river looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. The same gentle current. The same familiar bend. The same smooth stones resting beneath the clear water. His father bent down, picked up a small twig, and placed it gently on the surface. Together they watched it drift away. "Can you stop that twig?" The boy shook his head. "No. What if you reached into the water?" I might catch it. Again, the boy answered no. His father rested a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Remember this, my son. We are given many things in life to care for, but very few things to control. The words settled into the quiet evening like the first stars appearing above the valley. The boy listened carefully. He loved his father deeply. He trusted every lesson he offered, but there was one part he could not accept. If people were clever enough, if they worked hard enough, surely there had to be a way. Surely there had to be a way to keep the fields safe from floods, a way to keep families from suffering, a way to make tomorrow less uncertain than today. As they began walking home beneath the rising moon, the boy glanced back one last time. The river continued flowing exactly as before, calm, steady, unconcerned by the questions growing inside a young heart. Without realizing it, the boy whispered something so quietly that even his father did not hear. One day, I will understand how to make you listen. The river offered no reply. It simply continued its endless journey through the sleeping valley. By the time the first light touched the valley the next morning, the river had already forgotten the promise the boy had whispered to it. But the boy had not. Children have a remarkable way of carrying small thoughts until they quietly become the stories they believe about the world. For days afterward, he returned to the river whenever his work was finished. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. Sometimes he carried a smooth stick, tracing lines through the damp sand while watching the current slip past. He began noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The water did not always move at the same speed. One side of the river hurried. The other lingered. Tiny leaves drifted in different directions before finding the same current. Even the sunlight seemed to dance differently depending on the hour. The river was never repeating itself. It was always becoming. The more he watched, the more determined he became to understand it. Not simply to admire it, but to figure it out. If I can learn its patterns, he often thought, perhaps I can know what it will do tomorrow. At first, there was nothing unusual about that curiosity. Many discoveries begin with a simple question. But somewhere between curiosity and certainty, there is a path so narrow that few people notice when they cross it. The boy did not notice. Each evening he guessed where floating branches would travel. Sometimes he was right. Other times he was not. Whenever he guessed correctly, a quiet smile appeared on his face. Whenever he guessed wrong, he stayed longer, convinced he simply had not observed carefully enough. Little by little, the river stopped being a place of wonder. It became a puzzle, then a challenge. Then, without realizing it, something he hoped to master. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. A responsibility that slowly became an obsession. A desire to help that quietly became the need to control every outcome. It rarely happens all at once. It arrives one small step at a time, so gently that we often mistake it for dedication. One cool afternoon, as clouds drifted lazily across the sky, the boy noticed an elderly fisherman sitting alone beneath an old willow tree. The man had lived beside the river for longer than anyone could remember. His hands were rough from years of casting nets before sunrise. His face carried the peaceful expression of someone who had stopped arguing with life many years ago. The boy walked over and sat beside him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The fisherman seemed perfectly content to watch the water. Finally, the boy broke the silence. "Do you know this river better than anyone?" The old man chuckled. "I know it well enough to know that I never will." The answer surprised him. "But you've spent your whole life here." "I have." "Then shouldn't you understand everything it does?" The fisherman smiled as he picked up a small pebble and tossed it gently into the current. Ripples spread across the surface before quietly disappearing. "I understand enough to respect it," he said. "That has always been more useful than trying to understand everything." The boy frowned. He wanted certainty. The old fisherman seemed content with mystery. It felt like an unfinished answer. As the sun slowly lowered behind the western hills, the fisherman gathered his simple tools and stood. Before leaving, he looked kindly at the boy. "Never forget something important." "What is it?" "The river does not reward the person who tries hardest to command it." He paused. "It teaches the one who is willing to listen." The old man walked away without another word. The boy remained on the riverbank until the evening shadows stretched across the water. He listened. He watched. He waited. But all he could hear was the sound of a river that refused to explain itself. For several weeks, the valley remained wrapped in a gentle kind of peace. The mornings arrived with pale golden light. Children laughed along the riverbank. Farmers greeted one another across the fields before beginning another day of honest work. It seemed as though nothing could disturb the quiet rhythm of their little world. That was exactly what made the first raindrop so easy to ignore. It landed with barely a sound upon the river. Then another followed, and another. By evening, a soft rain had settled over the valley. No one was concerned. Rain was part of life. The fields welcomed it. The gardens drank deeply from it. The river accepted every drop without complaint. The boy stood beneath the roof of his family's porch, watching the gentle circles spreading across the water. "It will stop by morning," he said. His father looked toward the darkening sky, but offered no answer. The rain continued through the night. When dawn arrived, it had not grown louder, only steadier. The clouds hung low over the mountains, hiding their familiar peaks behind a curtain of gray. The river no longer reflected the sky. It carried it. Still, the villagers remained calm. They had seen many rainy seasons before. They continued planting, repairing fences, preparing meals, and sharing warm tea with neighbors. Life moved forward. The boy, however, could not stop watching the river. Each hour, the water crept a little higher against the stones. Its familiar song became deeper. Its current moved with a quiet confidence that seemed almost alive. He measured its height against the roots of an old willow tree. By afternoon, the water had climbed higher. He returned before sunset. Higher still, something inside him tightened. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. That evening he barely touched his supper. His mother noticed. "You have been thinking about the river all day." He nodded. "It keeps rising." She smiled gently. "So it does. Aren't you worried?" She placed another piece of bread into his bowl before answering. "I have learned that worrying and watching are not the same thing." The boy looked down. He did not fully understand her words. To him, watching naturally became worrying. If he watched closely enough, perhaps he could prevent something bad from happening. If he worried enough, perhaps he would be ready before everyone else. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the wooden roof. Inside, the fire crackled with quiet warmth. His parents spoke calmly about the coming harvest. His grandmother hummed an old melody as she mended a woven basket. The house felt peaceful, yet the boy's thoughts remained beside the river. Long after everyone else had fallen asleep, he quietly slipped from his bed and looked through the small window toward the darkness beyond the fields. He could not see the river anymore, but he could hear it. Its voice had changed. It was louder now, fuller, stronger. For the first time in his young life, the river sounded like something that could not be persuaded. It sounded like something that answered only to itself. The boy rested his hand against the cool wooden frame of the window. Without realizing it, he made another silent promise. "If no one else will understand you, then I will. And someday, I will find a way to keep everyone safe from whatever you become." By the third morning, the rain no longer sounded gentle. It drummed against rooftops with quiet determination, as though the sky had forgotten how to do anything else. The narrow paths through the village had become ribbons of soft mud. The familiar scent of fresh earth was replaced by the sharp smell of soaked timber and overflowing fields. People still smiled at one another, but their smiles were shorter now. Conversations ended with worried glances toward the river. No one needed to say its name. Everyone was thinking about it. The boy hurried there before breakfast. Long before he reached the riverbank, he heard it. The peaceful murmur he had known since childhood had disappeared. In its place was a deep, restless roar that echoed through the valley. When he finally stepped onto the high bank, he stopped without realizing it. The river was almost unrecognizable. The clear water had turned dark with soil carried down from the mountains. Branches spun helplessly through the current. Whole tree trunks drifted past as though they weighed nothing at all. The smooth stones he loved to sit upon had vanished beneath the rushing water. The river seemed wider, stronger, older. For the first time, the boy understood that what had always looked peaceful also possessed enormous power. His father arrived a few moments later and stood quietly beside him. Neither of them spoke. There are moments when silence is the only honest response. Together, they watched the current press against its banks. Each passing minute brought the water a little closer to the fields beyond. The boy felt his heart beating faster. "There must be something we can do," he whispered. His father kept his eyes on the river. "There may be." The boy looked up hopefully. "But not today." The answer felt impossible to accept. "If we wait." He hesitated. "Won't it become worse?" His father slowly nodded. "It might." "Then why are we standing here?" For several moments, only the river answered. Finally, his father bent down and picked up a handful of wet sand. He squeezed it tightly in his fist. Water escaped between his fingers. He squeezed harder. Even more water slipped away. Then he opened his hand completely. The remaining sand rested quietly in his palm. "There is a difference," his father said softly, "between caring for something and trying to force it to obey." The boy stared at the handful of sand. He understood what his father was saying. At least, he understood the words. But his heart refused the lesson. If people simply accepted everything, how would villages ever become safer? How would homes survive storms? How would families protect the people they loved? As another surge of water crashed against the bank, a single thought settled deep inside him. It did not arrive with anger or pride. It arrived disguised as responsibility. Someone has to find a better way. He looked once more at the powerful river. This time, he was no longer looking with wonder. He was looking with determination, and without speaking another word. The first battle between the boy and the river had already begun, though neither of them yet knew how many years it would last. Many years later, the people of the valley would remember that storm for the damage it left behind. The boy remembered it for an entirely different reason. It was the day he stopped asking what the river was trying to teach and began asking how it could be controlled. The rain finally passed. The clouds drifted eastward. Morning sunlight slowly returned to the valley, revealing a world that looked both familiar and strangely changed. The river had retreated into its banks as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the valley remembered. A wooden footbridge leaned awkwardly against a cluster of rocks nearly half a mile from where it had once stood. Long rows of crops lay flattened beneath layers of dark silt. Broken fences stretched across the fields like forgotten threads. Villagers worked quietly from sunrise until evening, helping one another clear fallen branches, repair homes, and gather whatever the flood had spared. No one complained. No one blamed the river. To them, the flood had simply become another season to endure. The boy could not understand that way of thinking. Each broken fence looked like a problem waiting for a solution. Each damaged field felt like evidence that someone, somewhere, should have prevented this. As he walked through the village, he noticed something else. The adults spoke very differently from the children. The children laughed again within a few days. They chased one another through puddles, turning scraps of driftwood into tiny boats that raced along narrow streams beside the road. The adults smiled at them, then quietly returned to rebuilding what had been lost. The boy stood between those two worlds, too young to accept loss as ordinary, too old to pretend nothing had happened. One afternoon, while helping his father replace a section of broken fencing, he finally asked the question that had been growing inside him since the storm. Why does everyone act as though this is normal? His father paused before driving another wooden post into ground. Because it is. But everything was damaged. His father nodded. Yes. Then shouldn't we stop it from happening again? For a long moment, the only sound between them was the steady tapping of a wooden mallet. Finally, his father looked toward the river. We should prepare. We should learn. We should help one another. Then he gently shook his head. But there is a difference between living wisely and believing life will never change again. The boy lowered his eyes. That difference still seemed too small to matter. In his heart, they sounded like the same thing. Preparation, control, safety. Surely they all belonged together. That evening, after the day's work was finished, he returned alone to the riverbank. The current flowed calmly once more, reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun as though the flood had never existed. He searched for the large stone where he used to sit. It was gone. Not broken. Not cracked. Simply gone. The river had carried it away. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty place. A strange sadness settled quietly over him. It was only a stone, yet it had always been there. Or so he believed. He knelt beside the water and let his fingers rest just beneath the surface. The current slipped gently around his hand. It did not resist him. It did not welcome him. It simply continued on its endless journey. For the first time, the boy spoke directly to the river. "You take too much." The river answered with nothing more than its endless song. He listened carefully, not because he expected a reply, but because, somewhere deep inside, he had already decided that one day he would be the one to answer it. The seasons continued their quiet procession across the valley. Spring awakened the orchards with delicate blossoms. Summer painted the hills in deep shades of green. Autumn covered the paths with leaves that drifted through the air like tiny golden birds. Winter wrapped the river in pale morning mist, softening every sound before the sun climbed above the mountains. To everyone else, the years seemed to flow as naturally as the river itself. To the boy, each passing season became another opportunity to study. While other children raced through the fields or climbed the old cedar trees, he often wandered alone with a small notebook tucked beneath his arm. He recorded the height of the river after every rainfall. He marked where the current curved more sharply than before. He measured the distance between the water and the roots of the oldest willow tree. At first, the villagers smiled when they saw him. "There goes our little scholar. He notices things the rest of us never see." Some even began asking him simple questions. "Do you think the rain will come early this year? Will the river rise before the harvest?" The questions pleased him, not because they made him feel important, but because they made him believe he was getting closer. Closer to understanding. Closer to preventing another flood. Closer to protecting everyone he loved. There's a quiet temptation that often hides inside good intentions. It whispers that if we can just learn a little more, plan a little better, think a little further ahead, then perhaps life will finally become predictable. The whispers sound wise. It sounds responsible. It even sounds loving. That is why so many gentle hearts mistake it for truth. One cool evening, the boy climbed a low hill overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the river winding through the fields like a silver ribbon disappearing into the distance. For the first time, he tried to imagine the river not as water, but as a problem. Where did it begin? Why did it bend where it did? Could those bends be changed? Could the current be slowed? Could stronger banks keep the water where it belonged? Question after question filled his mind. Each answer led to another question. The valley below grew darker as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Small lanterns began glowing in the windows of scattered homes. Families gathered for supper. Laughter floated softly through the evening air. Yet the boy remained on the hill. His body was in the present. His thoughts were already living in tomorrow. Perhaps you have known evenings like that. You finally sit down after a long day. The house grows quiet. Everything that truly needed your attention has already been done. And still, your mind refuses to come home. It keeps walking into futures that have not yet arrived. It keeps solving problems that do not yet exist. It keeps carrying burdens that today never asked you to carry. The boy did not realize it then, but peace had already begun slipping away from him. Not all at once, not loudly. It left the way the evening light leaves the valley, so gradually that no one notices the darkness until the stars have already appeared. By the time he reached his 17th year, people no longer saw him as a boy. His shoulders had grown broader from working in the fields. His hands carried the roughness that only honest labor can leave behind. His voice had become calm and steady, much like his father's. But inside, the same question still lived quietly within him. How can I keep tomorrow from becoming another storm? It followed him through every season. It sat beside him at every meal. It walked with him each time he visited the river. One crisp autumn morning, he noticed something no one else seemed to see. The current had shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to alarm the villagers. Not enough to change the course of the boats. Only enough to catch the attention of someone who had spent years studying every bend, every stone, and every whisper of the water. He returned the next morning, then the next. The change was real. A narrow section of the eastern bank was slowly disappearing. Just a handful of inches. So little that most people would have walked past without a second glance. He could not. He knelt beside the bank and pressed his hand into the damp soil. Small pieces crumbled into the water. The river accepted them without hesitation. It did not rush. It did not struggle. It simply continued doing what rivers have always done. That evening, he carried several large stones from a nearby hillside. One by one, he placed them along the edge of the bank. When he finished, he stepped back with quiet satisfaction. There, he whispered, that should help. The following morning, he hurried back before sunrise. The stones were gone. Not all of them, just enough. The current had slipped between them during the night, lifting two away as though they had weighed almost nothing. He frowned. Perhaps they had not been large enough. The next day, he brought larger ones. He packed them closer together. He pressed wet clay into the gaps. For a few days, the bank held. A small smile appeared on his face each time he walked past. It was only a few feet of riverbank, only a handful of stones. But to him, it felt like proof. Proof that nature could be persuaded. Proof that careful planning could overcome uncertainty. Proof that enough effort might one day keep the entire valley safe. Several villagers noticed his work. One elderly farmer stopped beside him and nodded with approval. That was clever. Another smiled. You've probably saved that part of the field. Their words settled warmly in his heart. He tried not to enjoy the praise, but he did. Not because he wanted admiration, because admiration sounded very much like confirmation. Perhaps he had been right all along. Perhaps the river simply needed someone willing to understand it better than everyone else. As the sun lowered behind the hills, he stood quietly watching the water move around the stones he had placed. For the first time in many years, he felt something that had been missing since the great storm. Not peace. Something far more dangerous. Confidence. The kind of confidence that quietly whispers, asterisk, you are beginning to master what others have accepted. Asterisk, far downstream, unnoticed by anyone in the valley. The river curved gently around another bend, as it always had, as it always would, patiently waiting for the day it would answer the young man's confidence with a lesson no wall of stone could ever hold back. Word of the young man's small success traveled through the valley more quickly than he expected. It was never announced. No one gathered to celebrate. Yet quiet stories have a way of reaching every doorstep. The eastern bank is holding. Perhaps the boy has found a better way. I heard he reinforced it with stone. Simple conversations like these drifted from garden to garden, from the marketplace to the fishing docks, until almost everyone had heard them. The young man tried to ignore the attention. He truly did. But every encouraging smile, every grateful nod, and every kind word settled gently inside his heart. It felt good to believe he was helping. It felt even better to believe that careful effort could change what everyone else had accepted. One afternoon, an elderly widow approached him while he was inspecting the riverbank. "My son," she said softly, "would you come look at the stream behind my house? It has been eating away at the garden." He agreed without hesitation. The stream was small, much smaller than the river. He rearranged a few rocks, cleared a fallen branch that had redirected the current, and packed fresh earth along the edge. When the next rain came, the garden remained untouched. The old woman smiled with tears in her eyes. "You have saved my vegetables." The young man smiled politely. It was nothing. But as he walked home that evening, another thought quietly joined the others already living inside him. If I can protect one garden, why not another? If I can strengthen one bank, why not the entire river? The idea did not feel arrogant. It felt compassionate. That is often how the most dangerous beliefs first arrive. Not dressed in pride, but wrapped in kindness. As the months passed, more villagers began asking for his advice. A farmer wanted help directing water toward a dry field. A fisherman wondered whether a small dock should be moved before the rainy season. Parents asked whether they should plant young fruit trees. The young man listened carefully to every question. He studied, he measured, he observed, and more often than not, his suggestions worked. The valley slowly came to trust his judgment. At first, he accepted that trust with humility, then with confidence, and little by little, with responsibility. He began waking before sunrise to inspect the river. He ended each evening making notes beside the fading light of an oil lamp. His notebook grew thicker with every passing season. Dates, measurements, rainfall, water levels, sketches of the river's changing curves. He believed he was collecting knowledge. Without realizing it, he was also collecting expectations. Not only his own, everyone else's. One evening, after another long day beside the river, he sat alone beneath the old willow tree where he had once spoken with the fisherman years before. The tree had grown larger. Its branches reached farther across the water. The river looked as peaceful as ever. For a few precious moments, he simply watched the current. No measurements, no calculations, no plans, only the quiet sound of flowing water. It reminded him of the evenings he had spent here as a child. A faint smile crossed his face. Then, almost without thinking, he noticed that one of the willow's roots had become exposed. The current had carried away a little more soil. The smile disappeared. His mind immediately began searching for a solution. He never realized that peace had just visited him and left again within the space of a single heartbeat. The following spring arrived earlier than anyone expected. Wildflowers covered the hillsides weeks before their usual time. The orchards bloomed so beautifully that travelers often stopped along the road simply to admire them. The valley seemed to breathe with quiet contentment. The young man, however, noticed something different. The snow in the distant mountains was melting faster than it had in previous years. Every morning, before most of the village had awakened, he climbed a small ridge overlooking the river. He watched the water with the careful eyes of someone searching for signs that others could not yet see. One morning, an elderly shepherd joined him. The old man leaned on his staff and smiled as the first rays of sunlight spread across the valley. "It is beautiful, is it not?" The young man nodded. Yes, but his eyes never left the river. After a few moments, the shepherd spoke again. "When I was your age, I came here every morning too." The young man looked at him with surprise. "Were you studying the river?" The shepherd laughed softly. "No, I was watching the sunrise." The young man smiled politely, though he did not quite understand. To him, the sunrise was simply the light that made it easier to observe the river. The old shepherd seemed to notice the thought passing through his mind. "There is something I have learned," he said. "When you spend too long looking for what might go wrong." He paused, allowing the morning breeze to finish the sentence in its own gentle way. "You slowly stop seeing everything that is already right." The words lingered between them. The young man wanted to agree. Instead, he found himself looking back at the river. The water had risen another inch. His thoughts immediately returned to measurements, to possibilities, to preparations. The shepherd followed his gaze. "I know that look." The young man turned toward him. "What look?" "The look of a man who believes the world is resting on his shoulders." The young man laughed quietly. "It does not." "No?" The shepherd smiled. "Then tell me, when was the last time you sat beside the river without trying to improve it?" The question landed gently. It felt strangely heavy. The young man searched his memory. He remembered measuring, planning, building, repairing, predicting, but simply sitting, simply listening, he could not remember. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was revealing. The shepherd rested a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "You have a generous heart. You care deeply. Never lose that." Then his voice became even softer. "But be careful. There comes a day when a person no longer serves their responsibilities. They begin serving their fears." With that, the old shepherd continued down the hillside, humming a tune so quiet it almost disappeared into the morning wind. The young man remained where he was. The river flowed peacefully below. Birds circled above the trees. Sunlight danced across the water exactly as it had countless mornings before. Everything around him invited stillness. Yet inside his mind, the conversation had already become another problem to solve. And without realizing it, he had just walked past another lesson the river had patiently placed in his path. For a little while, the shepherd's words stayed with him, not as an answer, but as a quiet interruption. Whenever he reached for his notebook, he would remember the old man's gentle question. Asterisk, when was the last time you simply listened? Asterisk. One evening, he decided to try. He left his measuring rope at home. He placed his notebook on the wooden table beside his bed. For the first time in many years, he walked to the river carrying absolutely nothing. The valley welcomed another peaceful sunset. A pair of swallows skimmed across the water before disappearing into the fading light. Somewhere farther downstream, children laughed while trying to skip flat stones across the surface. An elderly couple sat beneath the willow tree, saying almost nothing. Every so often, one of them smiled. The other smiled back. That was enough. The young man settled onto the grass. He folded his hands in his lap and watched the current. At first, it felt strangely uncomfortable. His eyes searched for problems out of habit. A loose branch, a worn section of bank, a fallen log caught between two rocks. His mind immediately began arranging solutions. Move the branch, reinforce the bank, clear the log before the next heavy rain. He closed his eyes for a moment. No, he whispered to himself. Just listen. So he listened. He heard the gentle rhythm of water brushing against smooth stones. He heard frogs beginning their evening chorus in the reeds. He heard the wind moving softly through the willow branches overhead. Little by little, his breathing slowed. The tightness in his shoulders eased. For a brief and beautiful moment, he remembered what the river had felt like when he was a child. Not a problem, not a project, not a responsibility. Simply a river. A quiet smile appeared on his face. It might have lasted only a few heartbeats. Then he noticed something. A narrow crack had formed in one of the stone barriers he had built months before. Water slipped through it in a thin silver stream. The smile vanished. Without thinking, he stood. He stepped into the shallow water and knelt beside the damaged stones. His hands immediately went to work. He pressed loose rocks back into place. He packed wet clay into the opening. He searched for larger stones nearby. By the time darkness covered the valley, his clothes were soaked. His hands were scratched. His back ached. Only then did he step away to inspect his work. The crack was gone. Satisfied, he nodded quietly to himself. As he began walking home beneath a sky filled with stars, he suddenly realized something. He could not remember a single sound the river had made that evening. He had come to listen. He had spent the entire sunset repairing. Far behind him, the river continued flowing beneath the moonlight. It neither thanked him nor criticized him. It simply carried the reflection of the stars toward the sea, just as it had long before he was born, and just as it would long after he was gone. There are moments in every life when praise feels almost impossible to refuse, not because we crave attention, but because it quietly confirms the story we have already begun telling ourselves. The young man did not think of himself as extraordinary. He thought of himself as useful, and usefulness, when left unchecked, can slowly become an identity. That summer, the valley experienced one of its driest seasons in many years. The river shrank just enough to reveal stretches of smooth stone that had remained hidden beneath the water for decades. Farmers grew anxious. Small irrigation channels no longer carried enough water to reach the outer fields. Whispers of concern spread through the village. If the rain delays another month, the western crops may not survive. One morning, several elders gathered beneath the large oak tree in the center of the village. After a long discussion, one of them came looking for the young man. "We could use your eyes." The words filled him with quiet pride. He followed them to the fields. Together, they walked the narrow channels that carried water from the river. Some had become clogged with fallen branches. Others had collapsed after years of neglect. The young man knelt beside the dry earth. He studied the slope, the current, the direction of the sunlight. Then he stood. If we widen this channel, he pointed toward a bend in the river, and clear the stones farther upstream, the water should reach these fields again. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. It would require several days of hard work, but they trusted him. By sunset, dozens of men and women were working side by side. Children carried away loose branches. Older villagers prepared food and cool water for everyone. The young man moved from one group to another, offering quiet instructions. 3 days later, water reached the dry fields once again. A gentle cheer rose across the valley. People embraced one another. Some laughed. Others wiped grateful tears from their faces. An elderly farmer placed both hands on the young man's shoulders. "You saved our harvest." The young man immediately shook his head. "No, we all did." His answer was sincere, yet something deeper stirred beneath his humility. If careful planning could save a harvest, what else might it save? That evening, as he walked home through the quiet village, nearly every person he passed offered a grateful smile. Some thanked him by name. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. Children waved excitedly. For the first time in his life, he felt as though the valley had begun leaning on him. It was a beautiful feeling, and a dangerous one, because once people begin believing you can solve their problems, it becomes very difficult to admit that some problems were never yours to solve. The moon rose slowly over the river. Its silver light stretched across the water like a narrow path leading into the darkness. The young man stopped for a moment to admire the view. It truly was beautiful. Then, almost without thinking, his eyes drifted toward the opposite bank. He noticed a section where the current had begun wearing away the soil. Only a little, hardly enough for anyone else to notice. He sighed quietly. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do. The river continued flowing beneath the moonlight, patient, silent, as though it already knew something the young man had not yet learned, that every problem he solved would slowly convince him that no problem should ever be allowed to exist. The years passed so quietly that no one in the valley could remember exactly when people stopped making their own decisions about the river. It happened little by little, one season at a time, one request at a time. "If you have a moment, could you look at my field? Would you tell me where to plant these young trees? Do you think this bridge will survive another winter?" The young man never refused. How could he? Each request came from someone he cared about. Each problem seemed small enough to solve, and each solution appeared to make life just a little easier for everyone. He believed he was serving the village. He never noticed that he had quietly become responsible for its peace of mind. One afternoon, as the harvest drew near, a farmer approached him with worried eyes. "The clouds are gathering earlier than usual." The young man looked toward the western mountains. Dark clouds rested against the distant peaks like heavy blankets. "They may bring rain. Should we harvest tomorrow?" The question lingered in the cool afternoon air. The young man studied the wind. He watched the birds. He listened to the river. Then he answered with calm confidence, "Wait one more day. The rain will pass north of the valley." The farmer smiled with visible relief. "I was hoping you would say that." The next morning, the village awoke beneath clear skies. By sunset, every field had been harvested. The storm had indeed passed far to the north. The villagers celebrated with grateful laughter. "You were right again. I told you he would know. It is a blessing to have someone who understands the river." Their words were offered with kindness, yet each compliment settled upon his shoulders like another invisible stone, not heavy enough to notice. At least not yet. That evening, he sat beside the river as he often did after a long day's work. The current shimmered beneath the fading light. Dragonflies skimmed across the surface. The valley was wrapped in the peaceful silence that arrives just before nightfall. He should have felt content. Instead, another thought entered his mind. What if I had been wrong? The celebration in the village suddenly looked different. He imagined a harvest ruined by rain, families losing their crops, children going hungry during the winter. The gratitude he had received only moments before quietly transformed into something else. Expectation. He lowered his eyes to the flowing water. For the first time, he realized that people no longer came to him simply because he was knowledgeable. They came because they believed he could keep uncertainty away. And perhaps he had begun believing it too. The river flowed past without slowing. Its surface reflected the evening sky so perfectly that the clouds seemed to drift beneath the water instead of above it. The young man stared at the reflection. Then, almost without realizing it, he whispered to himself, "I cannot afford to be wrong." The words disappeared into the evening. The river carried them away just as gently as it carried fallen leaves. But unlike the leaves, those words did not leave him. They remained quietly rooted inside his heart, where they would continue growing long after the sound of his voice had faded. There's a quiet burden that often follows those who are trusted. At first, it feels like gratitude. Then it becomes duty. And if we are not careful, duty slowly transforms into the belief that everything depends on us. The young man never announced such a belief. He would have denied it if anyone had asked. Yet his days quietly began to change. He woke before the first birds greeted the dawn. He walked the river while the village was still asleep. He inspected the bridges, the banks, the irrigation channels. Every fallen branch became something to remove. Every loose stone became something to repair. Every small change became something to record. The work itself did not exhaust him. The feeling that he might overlook something did. Some mornings, he reached home just as his mother was placing breakfast on the table. She smiled warmly. "You were with the river again." He nodded. There was work to do. She poured tea into a small clay cup and gently pushed it toward him. "The river has been doing its work for thousands of years." He smiled politely. "Yes, but we can still help." She looked at him with quiet affection. "We can." She paused for a moment before adding, "Just be careful not to believe the river has started depending on you." The young man laughed softly. "It does not." His mother smiled back. "I know, but sometimes our minds tell us stories that our hearts never questioned." He thanked her for the tea and left before the conversation could continue. Her words followed him for only a few minutes. Then another task claimed his attention. A section of the northern bank needed reinforcing before the next rainfall. By midday, he was already knee-deep in the water, directing several villagers as they carried stones into place. Everyone worked willingly. They trusted him. One young farmer paused while lifting a heavy rock. "I never worry when you're here." The words were meant as a compliment. The young man nodded with appreciation. Yet something inside him tightened. If people stopped worrying, then perhaps he would have to worry enough for all of them. The thought came and went so quickly that he barely noticed it. But his body did. That evening, while eating supper with his family, he found himself staring into the distance instead of tasting the food before him. His father quietly set down his bowl. "What are you thinking about?" "The northern bank." His father glanced toward the window. "You repaired it today." "I know, but what if the stones settle after the next rain?" His father smiled gently. "And if they do?" "I will have to repair them again." His father nodded. "Then repair them again." The answer frustrated him. There must be a way to make them stay forever. For a long moment, no one at the table spoke. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room. Outside, the evening breeze carried the familiar sound of the river through the open window. Finally, his father looked at him with calm, compassionate eyes. "My son, there are things in this world that become stronger because we care for them." He paused. "And there are other things that become heavier because we insist they should never change." The young man lowered his eyes. He wanted to understand. He truly did. But somewhere deep inside, he had already begun confusing permanence with protection. And without realizing it, he was preparing to spend the next chapter of his life chasing something the river had never once promised to give. Not long after that conversation, the valley entered one of the busiest harvest seasons anyone could remember. From the first light of dawn until the stars appeared, every family worked side by side. Laughter drifted through the fields. Children carried baskets that seemed almost too large for their small arms. Neighbors exchanged warm greetings as they passed one another along the narrow paths between the orchards. To anyone looking from a distance, the valley seemed wonderfully alive. Yet the young man noticed something few others did. Every joyful moment felt fragile, as though happiness itself depended upon everything continuing exactly as it was. One afternoon, while helping repair an old wooden bridge, he watched a little girl running after a bright yellow butterfly. She laughed so freely that several people nearby stopped working just to smile. For a brief moment, he smiled too. Then he noticed she was running toward the edge of the bridge. His heart tightened. Careful! His voice echoed across the river. The little girl stopped at once. She looked back, startled. Her father hurried over, gently took her hand, and thanked the young man for noticing. "It all happened so quickly," the father said. "I didn't even see her." The young man nodded. "It's all right." But as they walked away, another quiet thought settled inside him. If I hadn't been watching, what might have happened? That evening, similar thoughts followed him everywhere. When he passed the orchards, he noticed branches that might break in a strong wind. When he crossed the bridge, he imagined worn boards giving way beneath heavy carts. When he looked toward the river, he pictured unseen dangers waiting beneath its calm surface. The world itself had not changed, only the way he was looking at it. Perhaps you have known days like that. Days when your love for the people around you quietly transforms into constant vigilance. You begin noticing every possible danger, every possible mistake, every possible loss, not because the world has become more dangerous, but because your heart has become afraid of failing those it loves. That night, sleep came slowly. He woke several times before dawn. Each time, he listened for the sound of rain. Each time, he listened for the river. Each time, he reassured himself that everything was still quiet. By morning, he felt more tired than when he had gone to bed. His mother noticed the shadows beneath his eyes. "You didn't sleep." He smiled faintly. "I was thinking." She reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his. "My son, there's a kind of thinking that brings wisdom." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "And there is another kind that quietly steals tomorrow's strength before tomorrow even arrives." He looked at her with affection. "I'll rest when things settle down." She smiled sadly. Life has a habit of becoming something new just as we believe it is finally settling. Her words lingered in the quiet kitchen. Outside, beyond the open window, the river continued flowing with the same patient rhythm it had always known. It was never rushing toward tomorrow. It was never trying to hold on to yesterday. It simply flowed, one moment at a time. The young man heard the river, but he no longer knew how to hear what it had been saying all along. There is an old saying in many villages that a person does not notice the weight of the basket while adding one stone at a time. Only after many miles do they wonder why their shoulders ache. The young man never felt the moment his own basket became heavy. Responsibility arrived quietly. One promise, one request, one successful prediction, one grateful smile after another. Before long, he could no longer walk beside the river without searching for something that needed his attention. One cool morning, he found an elderly carpenter repairing a weathered footbridge near the western bend. The old man worked slowly, humming a melody that seemed older than the bridge itself. The young man watched for a moment before speaking. "That beam should be replaced." The carpenter looked up with a friendly smile. "It probably should. And those supports may not last another winter." "They may not." The young man stepped closer. "If we reinforce both sides now, they'll last much longer." The carpenter rested his tools on the bridge and studied the young man's face with quiet kindness. "You always seem to be looking ahead." The young man nodded. "If we prepare today, tomorrow becomes easier." "Sometimes." The carpenter picked up a small wood shaving and allowed the breeze to carry it into the river. "And sometimes tomorrow arrives with something none of us imagined." The young man frowned. "Shouldn't we still do everything we can?" "We should." The carpenter smiled. "But there is a difference between repairing a bridge." He gently tapped the weathered wood beneath his hand. "And believing you can repair uncertainty." The words settled into the morning like mist over the water. The young man wanted to answer. Instead, he looked toward the bridge. His eyes immediately found another loose plank, then a cracked railing, then a section of stone where the foundation might eventually weaken. His mind filled with another list, another plan, another tomorrow. The carpenter quietly returned to his work. He noticed that the young man's eyes never rested. Not once. As the sun climbed higher, they finished the repairs together. When the final plank was secured, the carpenter sat on the edge of the bridge and stretched his tired legs. "Sit with me." The young man hesitated. "There is still plenty to do. There always will be." After a moment, he finally sat down. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The river flowed gently beneath the bridge. A pair of ducks drifted lazily downstream. Somewhere beyond the trees, children laughed while chasing one another through the grass. The carpenter closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "What do you hear?" The young man listened. "The river, and the birds, and—" He paused. "The wind." The carpenter opened his eyes. "I hear something else." "What?" "A young man who has forgotten that life is happening while he is busy preparing for it." The young man lowered his gaze. He wanted to disagree. Yet somewhere deep inside, the words found a place that no argument could reach. Before they parted, the carpenter placed a gentle hand upon his shoulder. "Do not lose your gift. You notice what others miss. It will help many people." Then his expression softened. The young man watched the old carpenter disappear along the winding path until he became only a small figure beneath the cedar trees. The bridge had been repaired. The work was finished. Yet instead of walking home, he turned back toward the river once again. Somewhere inside him, a quiet voice still whispered that he had overlooked something. And so, while the rest of the valley welcomed another peaceful afternoon, he continued searching for the next problem waiting to be solved. It is a curious thing about the human mind. The more often it succeeds in preventing one small problem, the more convinced it becomes that every problem can be prevented. The young man never spoke those words aloud. He did not need to. They quietly shaped the way he saw the world. Autumn arrived with cool mornings and clear skies. The river flowed gently between banks dressed in shades of amber and crimson. Flocks of geese crossed the valley overhead, their distant calls fading into the pale blue horizon. Most of the villagers welcomed the season with grateful hearts. To them, autumn meant full granaries, shared meals, and peaceful evenings beside warm fires. To the young man, autumn meant preparing for winter. He inspected every storage shed, every wooden bridge, every irrigation gate, every pathway that heavy rain might wash away before the first snow. His notebook had grown thick over the years. Its pages were filled with careful sketches, measurements, observations, and plans. Sometimes he read through older entries late into the night. He searched for patterns, mistakes, anything that might help him stay one step ahead of tomorrow. One evening, as he turned another page, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the floor. He bent down to pick it up. It was a simple drawing. A river, a willow tree, a crooked little footbridge. He smiled. He had drawn it as a child. There were no measurements, no calculations, no careful notes in the margins. Only a bright sun in one corner of the page, and a tiny figure sitting happily beside the water. For a long moment, he stared at the drawing. He could almost remember that afternoon. The warmth of the grass, the smell of wildflowers, the sound of dragonflies hovering above the reeds. He remembered watching the river simply because it was beautiful, not because it needed to be understood, not because it needed to be changed, only because it was enough. A soft knock came at the open door. His grandmother stepped quietly into the room. She noticed the old drawing resting in his hands. "I haven't seen that in years," she said with a gentle smile. "Neither have I." She sat beside him. For a little while, they looked at the drawing together without speaking. Finally, she asked, "Do you remember that day?" "I think so. You were disappointed because the fish never came close enough to catch." He laughed softly. "I have forgotten that." She nodded toward the little figure in the drawing. "But you were smiling anyway." He looked again at the child he had once been. "I suppose I was." His grandmother's eyes remained on the picture. "You used to visit the river because it filled your heart." She paused. Now, her voice became almost a whisper. It seems you visit because it fills your mind. The room grew very still. Outside, the evening breeze carried the familiar sound of flowing water through the open window. The young man wanted to answer. Instead, he folded the drawing carefully and slipped it back between the pages of his notebook. For reasons he could not explain, he placed it near the very beginning, as though some quiet part of him hoped he had not traveled too far to find his way back again. For the next several days, the old drawing remained tucked inside his notebook. He told himself it was only a keepsake, a small reminder of childhood, nothing more. And yet, each time he opened the notebook to record another measurement or sketch another bend in the river, the folded paper quietly caught his attention. More than once, he almost unfolded it. More than once, he closed the notebook instead. There are memories that ask to be remembered, not because they belong to the past, but because they have been patiently waiting to guide the future. One cool evening, after finishing his final inspection of the Western Bank, he chose a different path home. It led through an old grove of cedar trees where he had not walked in years. The forest welcomed him with a familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the branches in long ribbons of gold. Nothing seemed to have changed. The moss still covered the ancient stones. The little stream still crossed the path before joining the river farther downstream. Even the old wooden bench, built long ago by villagers who had since passed away, remained beneath the tallest cedar. He sat down, not because he was tired, simply because for the first time in many months, there was nowhere he urgently needed to be. The silence felt unfamiliar. Not empty, just unfamiliar. At first, his thoughts continued their restless work. The northern irrigation channel should be inspected again. The eastern bank might need additional stones before winter. The old bridge would require fresh timber next spring. One thought followed another, then another, until almost without noticing, he heard something. A single bird singing somewhere high above him. Its melody was simple, unhurried. It did not seem concerned with tomorrow. The young man listened. A breeze moved gently through the cedar branches. The leaves answered with their own quiet music. Then came the distant sound of the river. Soft, steady, endless. For several peaceful moments, the valley seemed to breathe as one. The bird, the wind, the river, the trees. Everything belonged exactly where it was. A feeling he had not experienced in years slowly returned. Not accomplishment, not relief. Something gentler, contentment. It lasted only a little while. Then he noticed fresh footprints pressed into the damp soil beside the stream. He stood immediately. Someone had crossed here recently. The bank looked slightly disturbed. What if the soil became unstable? What if heavy rain widened the crossing? Should a small footbridge be built before spring? His mind awakened once again. The peaceful stillness vanished as quickly as morning mist beneath the rising sun. He sighed almost without realizing it. Looking back at the bench, he felt as though he had left something behind. Not an object, a feeling, one he could no longer hold for very long. As he continued toward home, the evening sky slowly deepened from gold to violet. Behind him, the cedar grove returned to silence. The bird continued singing. The wind continued moving through the branches. The river continued flowing. Nothing in the valley had asked him to carry it. Yet somehow, he still walked home feeling responsible for everything. There's a quiet question that life asks every one of us. Not once, but again and again. It never arrives with loud voices or dramatic moments. It comes softly, almost gently. The question is this: can you trust life, even when you cannot control it? The young man had been answering that question for years. He simply did not realize it. And every answer had been the same. No, not yet. Winter settled over the valley with unusual kindness. The mornings were cold, but the skies remained clear. Thin ribbons of mist floated above the river before the rising sun slowly dissolved them into the crisp morning air. The villagers welcomed the peaceful season. Families gathered around warm fires. Children carved little animals from pieces of fallen cedar. Even the river seemed quieter, moving with a slow confidence beneath the pale winter light. One afternoon, while walking along the southern bank, the young man noticed an elderly woman carrying two heavy buckets of water. Her steps were careful. The path had become slippery after a light frost. Without a second thought, he hurried over. "Please," he said with a warm smile. "Allow me." She thanked him, and together they walked toward her small cottage. The buckets were heavier than they looked. By the time they reached her gate, his arms ached slightly. The old woman noticed. "You carry many things." He laughed. "Only 2 buckets." She shook her head gently. "I wasn't speaking about the buckets." For a moment, neither of them spoke. She opened the wooden gate and looked back at him with kind eyes. "I've watched you for many years. You have helped almost everyone in this valley, and we are grateful." The young man lowered his head respectfully. "I've only done what anyone should do." She smiled. "No, you've done much more." Then her smile faded into quiet compassion. "And that is exactly what worries me." He looked at her, surprised. "Worries you?" She nodded. "When I was young, I believed I could keep everyone I loved safe." She looked toward the distant river shimmering beneath the winter sun. "I learned something that took me many years to accept." "What was it?" She answered so softly that the winter breeze almost carried the words away. "Love is not the same as control." The young man stood in silence. Those words reminded him of something. His father's handful of sand, the fisherman, the shepherd, the carpenter, his grandmother, his mother. Different voices, different years. Yet somehow, they all seemed to be pointing toward the same place. Before he could gather his thoughts, the old woman reached into one of the buckets. She lifted out a small wooden cup floating on the surface. Holding it out to him, she asked, "Tell me, does this cup carry the water?" He nodded. "Yes." She slowly turned the cup upside down. The water slipped quietly back into the bucket. "Can it keep the water forever?" He smiled faintly. "No." She placed the empty cup gently in his hand. "Our hearts are much like this." She closed his fingers around it. "They're meant to carry love, not imprison it." The young man thanked her and began the walk back toward the river. The little wooden cup remained in his hand the entire way home. Long after the old woman's footsteps had faded behind him, he still could not decide whether she had given him a gift or a question. That night, the little wooden cup rested beside his oil lamp. It was plain, unpainted, light enough to fit comfortably in the palm of his hand. He turned it over several times before setting it back upon the table. The old woman's words continued to echo quietly through his thoughts. Asterisk, our hearts are meant to carry love, not imprison it. Asterisk, he wanted to understand. He truly did. Yet another part of him resisted. If love did not protect, what was love for? If responsibility had limits, where should those limits be drawn? The questions followed him into the night. Long after the lamp had burned low, he finally drifted into sleep. Before dawn, he found himself dreaming. He was standing beside the river. The valley looked exactly as it always had. The same willow trees, the same winding path, the same quiet current slipping toward the distant sea. Then, without warning, every drop of water stopped moving. The river became perfectly still. Not peaceful, still. The birds fell silent. The reeds no longer swayed. Even the wind seemed unable to cross the valley. At first, the young man smiled. He had done it. The river could no longer surprise anyone. Nothing would be carried away. Nothing would change. Nothing could be lost. He took a step toward the water. The surface reflected his face as clearly as polished glass. Then he noticed something strange. The reflection did not smile back. It looked tired, older. Its eyes carried a loneliness he had never seen before. A single leaf drifted down from the willow tree. It touched the frozen surface and remained there. Hours seemed to pass. The leaf never moved. More leaves followed, then branches, then dust carried by the wind. Everything that once flowed began collecting upon the silent river. The clear water slowly disappeared beneath lifeless debris. The air grew heavy. The valley lost its familiar scent. The birds did not return. The fish were nowhere to be seen. The beauty he had tried so hard to preserve slowly faded before his eyes. A quiet voice seemed to rise from somewhere beyond the mountains. Or perhaps, from somewhere deep within his own heart. What no longer flows. The voice paused. Can no longer give life. The young man tried to answer. No sound came. He reached toward the motionless river. The instant his fingertips touched the water, the entire valley shattered like fragile glass. He woke with a sudden breath. The room was dark. Only the last ember in the fireplace still glowed softly. For several moments, he remained perfectly still. He could hear it, outside the window, the familiar sound of the river, flowing, unhurried, alive. Never before had its quiet song sounded so comforting. He almost smiled. Almost. Then another thought quietly entered his mind. Asterisk, it was only a dream. Asterisk. He lay back down, closed his eyes, and before sleep found him once again, he convinced himself that dreams were nothing more than wandering thoughts. Outside, the river continued its endless journey beneath the stars, still patiently teaching the lesson he was not yet ready to receive. By the time spring returned, the dream had become little more than a distant memory, or so the young man believed. Dreams have a curious way of leaving even after we think they are gone. Sometimes they disappear from the mind, only to remain quietly inside our choices. The valley awakened once again. Apple blossoms floated through the morning air like soft white snow. Children ran barefoot across the fields. The familiar laughter of neighbors returned to the marketplace after the long winter. Everywhere he looked, life seemed eager to begin again. The river welcomed the season as it always had. Its waters rose gently with the melting snow from the mountains. Not in anger, not in haste, simply following a rhythm older than memory itself. The young man noticed the rising water before anyone else. He always did. Each morning, he marked its height against the same weathered willow tree. 1 inch, then another, then another. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual. Yet something inside him refused to relax. The dream had whispered that a river must flow. His waking mind whispered something very different. Asterisk, a flowing river must still be managed. Asterisk, one afternoon, several younger villagers gathered beside the eastern bank, where children often played after finishing their chores. They laughed as they skipped stones across the water. One smooth stone bounced 8 times before disappearing beneath the surface. The others cheered. The young man watched them from a distance. A smile almost appeared. Then he noticed how close they stood to the edge. The bank had softened after several days of light rain. He walked toward them. Gently, he called. The ground is weaker than it looks. The children immediately stepped back. One little boy looked up at him. Is the river dangerous? The young man paused. He looked at the calm water, the gentle current, the sunlight dancing across its surface. Then he answered, It can be. The children nodded and wandered towards safer ground. They quickly found another game. Within moments, they were laughing again. The young man remained where he was. His eyes stayed fixed on the river long after the children had forgotten about it. An elderly woman who had been washing clothes nearby quietly observed him. After wringing out a linen cloth, she smiled. You see danger where children still see wonder. The young man returned her smile. Someone has to. She nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps. She spread another cloth across a smooth stone to dry. But promise me something. What is it? When you look at this river. She glanced toward the sparkling current. Do not forget to see what the children still see. He followed her gaze. The sunlight shimmered upon the water. A family of ducks drifted peacefully downstream. Cherry blossoms landed softly upon the surface before continuing their quiet journey. It truly was beautiful. He knew that. He appreciated it. Yet before long, his eyes found the weakened bank again. His thoughts returned to repairs, to stronger foundations, to future storms. The old woman watched him for another moment before lowering her eyes. She said nothing more. Sometimes wisdom knows when words have already done all they can. The river flowed gently between them. To one pair of eyes, it was still a place of joy. To the other, it had quietly become a responsibility that never seemed to rest. There are seasons when life grows so gentle that we begin to believe our worries have finally been justified. We tell ourselves that all the planning, all the careful preparation, all the sleepless nights must have been the reason everything turned out well. The young man quietly believed this too. The river remained within its banks. The harvest looked promising. The bridges stood firm. The irrigation channels carried water exactly where they were meant to go. Everywhere he looked, there seemed to be proof that vigilance was paying off. One afternoon, as he walked through the village square, several people called out to him with warm smiles. "You should come see the western fields. The new channel works beautifully. We've never had water spread so evenly." He accepted their gratitude with humble words. But gratitude has a curious echo. It continues speaking long after everyone else has fallen silent. As he walked away, he found himself thinking, asterisk if I had not noticed that problem. Asterisk, asterisk if I had waited another week. Asterisk, asterisk if I had been less careful. Asterisk. The thoughts sounded harmless, even responsible, yet each one quietly strengthened an invisible belief. That peace depended on him. Late that afternoon, he climbed the small hill overlooking the valley. From there, he could see nearly everything. The river winding through the fields, smoke rising from kitchen chimneys, children chasing one another between rows of fruit trees, a shepherd guiding his flock toward fresh grass. It was the kind of view that had once filled him with gratitude. Now, he found himself conducting another inspection. The northern fence needed replacing before winter. The southern footpath might flood after several days of rain. The old willow tree leaned a little farther toward the water than it had last year. His eyes moved from one concern to the next, never stopping, never resting. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. It is difficult to admire a painting when you spend all your time searching for cracks in the frame. He turned. Sitting on a nearby rock was the elderly fisherman he had met many years before. Time had bent the old man's back. His hair had become completely white, yet his eyes still held the same peaceful light. The young man smiled with genuine affection. "It has been a long time." The fisherman nodded. "It has." They stood together, looking across the valley. After a while, the old man asked, "What do you see?" The young man answered without hesitation, "I see work that still needs to be done." The fisherman smiled gently. "I thought you might." He lifted one weathered hand and pointed toward the horizon. "I see a family eating together before sunset." He pointed again. "I see children laughing." Again, "I see birds returning home." Then he lowered his hand. "And I see a young man who has forgotten to notice these things." The words were spoken without judgment, only kindness. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. A warm breeze moved across the hillside, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and river water. Far below, the evening sun scattered thousands of tiny diamonds across the flowing current. The fisherman breathed in deeply. What a beautiful evening! The young man followed his gaze. It truly was. For one quiet heartbeat, he saw exactly what the old man saw. Beauty. Simple. Complete. Enough. Then his eyes drifted toward the western bank. A section of soil had begun to darken where water slowly seeped through the earth. His shoulders tightened once more. "I should go," he said softly. "There is something that needs my attention." The fisherman did not try to stop him. He simply watched the young man hurry down the hillside. Only after he had disappeared among the trees did the old man whisper to the empty breeze, "The saddest prisons are the ones whose doors were never locked." The old fisherman remained upon the hillside long after the young man had disappeared. The evening grew quieter. One by one, the first stars awakened above the valley. The river welcomed each reflection without trying to keep a single one. Far below, the young man reached the western bank just as the last light slipped behind the mountains. The patch of dark soil he had noticed from the hill was still there. He knelt beside it. The earth was damp. A thin ribbon of water escaped through the bank before returning to the river. Most people would have stepped over it without a second thought. He could not. He removed his outer robe and folded it neatly upon a nearby rock. Then he began gathering stones, one after another. Some are no larger than his hand. Others required both arms to lift. By the time the moon had risen above the trees, a small barrier stood where the water had been slipping through. He pressed fresh clay between the stones with careful fingers. He stepped back, watched, waited. The trickle slowed, then stopped. A quiet feeling of satisfaction settled over him. There, he whispered. That should last. He remained there for several more minutes, studying every detail to make certain nothing had been overlooked. Only then did he begin the walk home. The village had already fallen asleep. Lanterns glowed softly behind wooden windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before the night returned to silence. As he crossed the old footbridge, he paused. The river shimmered beneath the moonlight. It looked peaceful, almost impossibly peaceful. He leaned against the wooden railing and listened. For just a moment, the familiar urge to inspect, calculate, and improve seemed to fade. The water spoke in its ancient language of flowing currents and patient time. The wind carried the scent of cedar through the cool night air. His breathing slowed. Perhaps, he thought, the fisherman had been right. Perhaps beauty had been waiting for him all along. Then he heard it, a faint cracking sound. His head turned immediately toward the bridge beneath his feet. He crouched and ran his hand along one of the support beams. A small split had opened in the aging timber. It was nothing urgent, nothing dangerous. Not tonight. Still, he remained there, studying it beneath the moonlight. How wide was the crack? Would winter moisture make it worse? Should the beam be replaced before the first heavy rain? The peaceful moment disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. By the time he reached home, he had already planned the repairs. Inside the house, everyone was asleep. He lit a small oil lamp without making a sound. Then he opened his notebook. Under the date, he carefully wrote, Western Bank reinforced. Bridge support beginning to split. Inspect again within 3 days. He closed the notebook. The little wooden cup the elderly woman had given him still rested beside the lamp. He picked it up for a moment, turned it slowly in his hands, then placed it back exactly where it had been. Outside, the river flowed through the darkness with the same quiet certainty it had always known. It did not keep records. It did not make plans. It simply continued its endless journey toward a lesson the young man was drawing closer to with every passing day, even as he believed he was moving farther away from it. A few days later, the valley celebrated the festival of first light. It was one of the oldest traditions anyone could remember. Before sunrise, families gathered beside the river, carrying small paper lanterns, each one holding a tiny candle that flickered gently against the morning breeze. Some lanterns carried quiet prayers. Some carried gratitude. Others carried memories of loved ones who were no longer there to watch the dawn. No one spoke loudly that morning. There was something about the river that invited softer voices. The young man arrived early, as he always did, not to join the celebration, to inspect the riverbank before everyone else arrived. He walked slowly along the shore, studying the damp earth left behind by the night's cool mist. The bridge, the willow roots, the stones he had reinforced only days before. Everything seemed secure. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a little easier. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, the villagers began placing their lanterns upon the water. One by one, tiny lights drifted into the current. Hundreds of them. Each lantern floated for only a short while before disappearing around the first bend in the river. Children waved happily as though the lights were setting off on a grand adventure. Parents stood quietly with folded hands. Some smiled. Some wiped away silent tears. The young man watched the lanterns disappear. A little girl, standing nearby, tugged gently at her grandfather's sleeve. Why don't we tie strings to them? The old man smiled. So they won't float away. He chuckled softly. My dear, if we tied them down, they would never make the journey they were meant to make. The little girl thought about this very seriously. Then she nodded. Together, they released another lantern. The young man heard every word. His eyes followed that single lantern as it drifted farther and farther downstream. A strange feeling stirred within him. Part of him admired its freedom. Another part wanted to reach into the water and guide it safely past every rock, every branch, every hidden current. He imagined how easily the little flame could be extinguished. The thought made him uneasy. Beside him, his grandmother quietly appeared without making a sound. She had become slower with age, yet her peaceful presence remained unchanged. She watched the lanterns for a long while before speaking. When I was a little girl, she smiled at the memory. I cried every year. He looked at her with surprise. Why? Because I didn't want my lantern to disappear. He smiled. What changed? She looked toward the distant bend where the last of the lights slowly vanished from sight. I finally understood. She paused, allowing the silence to finish part of the lesson. That disappearing from my eyes did not mean disappearing from the world. The young man followed her gaze. The lanterns are gone now. The river looked exactly as it had before the festival began. Calm, endless, unconcerned with holding on. His grandmother gently slipped her hand into his. You spent so many years protecting this river. He nodded quietly. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. I only hope. Her voice became almost a whisper. That one day you allow the river to protect you. The young man turned toward her. He wanted to ask what she meant. But before he could speak, she smiled, patted his hand, and slowly walked back toward the village. He remained alone beside the water. The river carried no lanterns now, only the quiet reflection of the morning sky. For reasons he could not explain, his grandmother's words stayed with him far longer than the lanterns themselves. The days following the festival were unusually peaceful. The sky remained clear. The river settled into its familiar rhythm. Even the wind seemed content to wander gently through the valley without disturbing a single branch. Many of the villagers welcomed the quiet with grateful hearts. The young man treated it differently. To him, peaceful days were opportunities. If there were no urgent problems to solve, he could prepare for the ones that had not yet arrived. Each morning, he left home before sunrise. Each evening, he returned after the stars had filled the sky. His notebook continued to grow thicker. So did the lines upon his face. One afternoon, while measuring the depth of a narrow channel near the northern fields, he heard footsteps behind him. It was his father. The older man's hair had become almost completely silver. His movements were slower now, but there was still a quiet strength about him that age had not diminished. You've been looking for me, the young man said. His father smiled. I have. Is something wrong? No. The older man looked around at the measuring ropes, wooden stakes, and neatly stacked stones. I simply wanted to spend a little time with my son. The young man smiled warmly. I'm almost finished here. His father glanced toward the river. I've heard you say that for many years. The words were gentle. There was no criticism in them, only affection. The young man looked down at the tools scattered around his feet. I suppose there is always one more thing to check. His father nodded. There always will be. They began walking slowly along the riverbank together. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt comfortable, like an old blanket that had been shared through many winters. At last, his father stopped beside the willow tree where they had stood together so many years before. Do you remember bringing a little twig here? The young man laughed softly. I do. And do you remember asking why the river never stayed the same? I remember. His father bent down and picked up another small twig from the ground. Without saying a word, he placed it gently upon the water. Together they watched it drift away. It still knows where to go, the older man said. The young man followed the twig until it disappeared around the bend. Yes. His father turned toward him. And what about you? The question caught him by surprise. What do you mean? You spend every day deciding where the river should go. His father's eyes were kind. But I wonder. He paused for a long moment. When was the last time you asked where your own heart is going? The young man opened his mouth to answer. No words came. He had answers for rainfall, for riverbanks, for bridges, for seasons, but not for that question. His father smiled gently, as though he had expected the silence. There is nothing wrong with caring. He rested a weathered hand upon his son's shoulder. Just remember, If your heart becomes so busy carrying tomorrow, it may quietly set down today without ever noticing. The afternoon breeze stirred the willow branches overhead. Tiny leaves fluttered into the river and floated away without hesitation. The young man watched them until they disappeared from sight. For a brief moment, he wondered what it might feel like to move through life with such effortless trust. Then, from somewhere upstream, came the distant sound of rushing water against stone. His attention shifted immediately. His eyes narrowed. Without thinking, he took a step toward the sound. His father noticed. He did not try to stop him. He simply watched his son hurry away once more, while the little twig continued its quiet journey toward the sea. The sound had come from nothing more than a fallen branch. It had drifted against a cluster of rocks before the current finally pulled it free. By the time the young man reached the bend, the river had already solved the problem on its own. He stood there for a long moment. The branch was gone. The current flowed as smoothly as before. A quiet laugh escaped his lips, not because anything was amusing, because he suddenly realized how quickly his heart had raced over something that no longer existed. For just an instant, he considered returning home. Then his eyes wandered farther upstream. A pile of smaller branches had collected near the opposite bank. They could become a blockage, he murmured. Without another thought, he crossed the shallow water and began clearing them away. The afternoon slipped quietly into evening. One small task became another. Another became three more. By the time he finally looked toward the sky, the sun had already disappeared behind the mountains. He had missed supper. Again, when he reached home, the house was almost completely dark. Only one small lamp remained burning beside the doorway. His mother was waiting. Not anxiously, simply waiting. She smiled the moment she saw him. "I kept your meal warm." A gentle wave of guilt passed through him. "I am sorry. There was more work than I expected." She placed the bowl before him. Steam still rose softly from the soup. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the quiet clink of his spoon against the clay bowl. Then his mother asked, "Was it important?" He nodded immediately. It could have become a problem later. She accepted the answer without argument. Instead, she poured another cup of tea and watched the steam curl gently into the air. "When you were little," she said, "you always hurried home before sunset." He smiled. "I didn't want to miss your cooking." She laughed. "I know." Her laughter faded into a peaceful silence. But lately, she looked at him with eyes full of warmth. "It feels as though the river sees more of you than we do." The young man lowered his gaze. He wanted to explain. He wanted her to understand that every hour he spent beside the river was for the good of everyone, including her, including his father, including every child playing along its banks. Yet the words would not come, perhaps because deep inside, he already knew something had quietly changed. He had once cared for the river because he loved the people. Now, he was beginning to love the responsibility itself. That realization lingered only for a heartbeat before he gently pushed it aside. Surely that could not be true. Surely he was only doing what needed to be done. After supper, he stepped outside for a few moments before bed. The valley had settled into perfect stillness. Above him, countless stars filled the night sky. Below, the river reflected them with effortless grace. He remembered something the old fisherman had once said. Asterisk. The river teaches the one who is willing to listen. Asterisk. He closed his eyes. He truly wanted to listen. The breeze touched his face. The water whispered across smooth stones. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the darkness. Then, almost instinctively, he found himself wondering whether the eastern bank would need another inspection before the weekend. He opened his eyes and sighed quietly. The river had been speaking all along. It was his own restless thoughts that had become too loud to hear it. There are burdens that arrive all at once. A sudden illness, an unexpected loss, a storm that changes everything before nightfall. And then there are burdens that settle upon the heart so gently that we mistake them for purpose. The young man had long since stopped noticing the difference. Before sunrise each morning, he was already walking beside the river. After sunset each evening, He was usually the last person still awake in the valley, studying his notes beneath the warm glow of an oil lamp. The notebook had become more than a record. It had become a companion, a promise, almost a shield against uncertainty. One chilly morning, while he was comparing water level from previous years, he heard cheerful voices behind him. Several children were building tiny boats from pieces of cedar bark. They knelt along the edge of the river, laughing whenever one little boat raced ahead of the others. One boy looked up and called to him, "Would you like to race one with us?" The young man smiled. "I should finish my work first. It will only take a minute." He looked down at the notebook in his hands. There were still several measurements to record before the sunlight changed. "I'll join you another day." The children nodded without disappointment. At their age, joy moved easily from one moment to the next. Within seconds, they were laughing again, completely absorbed in their little race. The young man returned to his notes. A few moments later, a burst of laughter echoed across the water. Without meaning to, he glanced up. One small boat had become caught in a gentle swirl near the shore. Instead of trying to rescue it, the children clapped their hands and laughed as the current slowly carried it free again. To them, even the unexpected had become part of the game. The young man watched in silence. He realized something almost painful. If that had happened to him, he would have searched for a way to prevent it from happening again. The children simply smiled and watched the river continue its journey. An old memory quietly returned. He saw himself sitting on this very bank as a little boy, bare feet resting in the cool grass. A crooked little boat made from bark and twine floating downstream. He remembered cheering when it rounded the bend. He had not cared where it ended, only that it floated. The memory faded as quickly as it had come. He lowered his eyes once more. His notebook waited patiently in his hands. He wrote another measurement, then another. By the time he looked up again, the children had already gone home. The riverbank was quiet once more. Only a single tiny cedar boat remained. It had drifted against a smooth stone near the shore. The young man walked over and picked it up. It was clumsily made. The bark had already begun to soften in the water. It would never last very long. He turned it gently between his fingers. Then, after a long pause, he carried it back to the river. Instead of placing it safely upon a rock, he set it once more upon the current. The little boat drifted away without hesitation. He watched until it disappeared around the bend. A faint smile touched his face. It stayed there a little longer than usual, long enough for the river to notice. Or perhaps, long enough for him to notice the river. The little cedar boat remained in his thoughts for the rest of the day. Not because it was beautiful. It was not. Its edges were uneven. Its tiny mast leaned slightly to one side. By tomorrow, it would likely be caught beneath a fallen branch or resting unnoticed along some distant shore. Yet it had carried something far more lasting than wood. It had carried a memory. That evening, as the young man walked home beneath the fading light, he realized he had smiled more during those few moments than he had in many weeks. The realization surprised him, not because joy had become impossible, but because it had become unfamiliar. When he reached the house, his father was sitting outside, repairing an old fishing net. The older man's fingers moved slowly, weaving broken strands together with patient care. The young man sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt peaceful. Then his father held up the net. "What do you see?" The young man studied it carefully. "A tear." His father smiled. "I thought you might." He turned the net slightly. "And what else?" The young man looked again. This time, he noticed how much of the net remained strong. Only a small corner needed mending. He gave a quiet laugh. "I almost missed that." His father nodded. "We often do." The old man continued threading the cord through the broken places. "Our eyes become very good at finding what is wrong." He gently pulled the knot tight. "If we are not careful, they forget to recognize what has remained whole." The young man watched the net resting across his father's knees. One small tear, hundreds of strong knots. Yet his eyes had found the tear first. He wondered how many other things in his life had begun that way. How many mornings had he walked beside a beautiful river, only to notice the one stone that seemed out of place? How many evenings had he stood beneath a sky filled with stars, only to worry about tomorrow's weather? Perhaps, he thought, the world had not become heavier. Perhaps his attention had simply learned to carry weight more easily than wonder. The thought lingered quietly between one heartbeat and the next. His father folded the repaired net and looked toward the river, now glowing softly beneath the rising moon. Do you know why fishermen mend their nets at the end of the day? So they will be ready tomorrow. Yes, the old man smiled, but also because night belongs to rest. He looked at his son with gentle eyes. If I spent every evening imagining every fish that might escape tomorrow, I would never notice how peaceful tonight already is. The young man followed his father's gaze. The valley was wrapped in silence. A cool breeze carried the scent of cedar through the air. Somewhere nearby, crickets had begun their familiar evening song. Nothing demanded his attention. Nothing needed to be repaired. Nothing asked him to solve it. For several precious moments, he allowed himself to simply be there. The river flowed quietly in the darkness, not asking to be controlled, only inviting anyone willing to listen, to flow with it, if only for a single peaceful evening. The next morning arrived, wrapped in a gentle fog. The mountains appeared only as soft shadows beyond the valley, while the river seemed to emerge from a mist and disappear into it again a few hundred yards downstream. It was the kind of morning that invited people to slow their steps. The young man tried. He truly did. As he walked beside the water, he remembered his father's words from the evening before. Asterisk, night belongs to rest. Asterisk, for once he had slept deeply. No dreams, no anxious thoughts, only quiet. He wondered if perhaps something inside him had finally begun to soften. The thought stayed with him until he reached the old willow tree. There, he noticed fresh footprints pressed into the damp earth. Large footprints, several of them. His attention sharpened immediately. He followed the tracks toward the river. A merchant's wagon had crossed the shallow ford before sunrise. Its heavy wheels had carved deep ruts into the muddy bank. One section of earth had collapsed into the water. The damage was small, almost insignificant. Still, his peaceful morning quietly slipped away. He measured the depth of the rut with a stick. He examined the direction of the current. He estimated how much more soil might be carried away if another wagon crossed before the ground had time to dry. Within minutes, his mind was working as it always had. A stronger crossing, additional stones, perhaps wooden supports beneath the bank. The list grew longer with every passing thought. Just then, an elderly traveler leading a tired horse stopped nearby. He watched the young man studying the ground. Good morning, the traveler said warmly. The young man looked up and returned the greeting. You seem to have found something important. The bank has been damaged. The traveler stepped closer and looked where the young man pointed. After a moment, he smiled. It will heal. The young man shook his head. Not if more wagons come through. The old traveler nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps. He dipped a small wooden cup into the river and offered a drink to his horse. The animal drank calmly, then lifted its head with a contented sigh. You know, the traveler said, gently stroking the horse's neck, I have crossed this river for nearly 30 years. The young man looked at him with interest. I've watched floods carry away roads. I've watched drought expose stones no one knew were there. I've watched children become grandparents. And every time I return, he smiled toward the flowing water. The river is different. He turned back to the young man. So am I. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The mist drifted slowly across the water. A pair of herons rose gracefully into the morning sky. Finally, the traveler tightened the strap on his saddle. I used to think my journey became easier when the road stopped changing. He chuckled softly. It took me many years to discover something better. What was that? The young man asked. The road never promised to stay the same. He rested one hand over his heart. It only asked whether I could keep walking. With that, the old traveler smiled, thanked the young man for the conversation, and continued along the winding path until both he and his horse disappeared into the morning mist. The young man remained where he was. His eyes drifted from the footprints to the river, then back again. The bank could be repaired. The ruts would eventually disappear. Even the footprints themselves would soon be washed away. He knew all of that. Yet one question lingered quietly in his mind. If every mark upon the earth was destined to fade, why did he spend so much of his life believing that every change had to be prevented? For the first time in many years, the young man did not answer the question immediately. He carried it with him instead. Through the morning, across the fields, along the winding paths that connected one family to another. The question asked nothing of him. It simply walked beside him. That afternoon, he visited an elderly farmer whose orchard bordered the river. Several apple trees leaned slightly toward the water after years of growing in the soft earth. The farmer smiled as the young man approached. "I thought you might come. You've noticed the trees." The young man nodded. "The bank is wearing away beneath them." "It is. We should reinforce it before autumn." The old farmer looked at the trees for a long while before answering. "Perhaps." The response surprised him. "You don't seem concerned." The farmer chuckled quietly. "Oh, I am." He rested a weathered hand against the rough bark of the nearest tree. "I planted this orchard with my wife almost 40 years ago." His fingers lingered gently upon the trunk. "Every tree here carries one of our memories." The young man listened in silence. The farmer continued. "That one bloomed the year our first daughter was born." He pointed farther down the row. "Those two survived the great frost." Another smile crossed his face. "And the smallest tree." He laughed softly. "My grandson planted that one upside down." The young man found himself smiling too. For a few moments, the orchard became more than trees. It became a lifetime. Then his eyes returned to the riverbank. "The soil is still disappearing." The farmer nodded. "It is. Aren't you afraid one of the trees may fall?" The old man looked toward the flowing water. "I used to be." "What changed?" He bent down and picked up a ripe apple that had fallen naturally onto the grass. Holding it gently in his hands, he asked, "Tell me, when do you think this apple became sweet?" The young man looked puzzled. "I don't know." "Yesterday." The farmer smiled. "Last week?" He shook his head. "It became sweet because every season did exactly what it was meant to do. The spring rains, the summer sun, the cool autumn nights, even the winter that looked as though it had killed the tree." He held the apple toward the young man. "If I had spent every day trying to stop the wind," he glanced toward the river, "or arguing with the rain, I would have forgotten to taste this." The young man accepted the apple. Its skin was warm from the afternoon sun. Its fragrance carried the sweetness of an entire season. He took a small bite. The farmer smiled. "How is it?" The young man closed his eyes for just a moment. "It is wonderful." "It is." The old man looked across the orchard with peaceful gratitude. And one day, he rested his hand once more upon the nearest tree. "This tree will fall." The young man's smile faded. The farmer nodded gently. "I'll be sad, very sad, but I refuse to spend today's sweetness mourning tomorrow's loss." The breeze moved softly through the branches. Several ripe apples loosened from the trees and landed quietly upon the grass. None of them hurried. None of them resisted. They simply arrived at the moment they were ready. The young man stood silently among the trees, holding the apple in his hand. For reasons he could not explain, it tasted different now, not sweeter, more precious, as though the farmer had somehow revealed a flavor that had been there all along. A flavor he had been too busy preparing for tomorrow to notice today. The young man left the orchard just before sunset. The apple remained in his hand long after he had finished eating it. Only the small stem was left. He looked at it for a moment before gently placing it beneath a young tree growing beside the path. Without thinking, he smiled. Some gifts, he realized, are completed only when they are returned. The path home followed the river for nearly a mile. Evening had begun laying long ribbons of amber across the water. The current carried those colors as effortlessly as it carried fallen leaves. Nothing hurried. Nothing hesitated. Everything simply moved when it was time to move. The young man slowed his pace, not because he had reached a decision, because the orchard had left his heart unusually quiet. He noticed things that had escaped him for many years. a dragonfly resting on a reed instead of darting through the air. The soft rings spreading across the surface where a fish had risen for only an instant. A family of turtles warming themselves on a sunlit log. None of them appeared worried about tomorrow. Life was simply unfolding around them. He wondered what it might feel like to live with such complete trust. Then he heard voices. A little farther downstream, 3 boys were trying to free a small fishing net tangled among the reeds. The youngest pulled with all his strength. The more he struggled, the tighter the net became. The other 2 laughed. "You're making it worse." "I know, but it won't come loose." The young man started toward them, ready to untangle the net himself. He had taken only a few steps when an old fisherman, sitting quietly in a nearby boat, raised one gentle hand. "Wait." The young man stopped. The fisherman did not move toward the children. He simply watched. After another minute of tugging and laughing, the oldest boy suddenly said, "Stop pulling." The 3 of them became still. The youngest released the rope. The current shifted ever so slightly. The reeds loosened their grip. The little net floated free almost by itself. All 3 boys burst into laughter. "I told you we'd get it." They gathered the net, thanked the old fisherman with cheerful waves, and ran happily back toward the village. The fisherman remained where he was. Only then did he glance toward the young man. "You were about to help them." "I was." "Why didn't you?" The young man smiled. "You asked me to wait." The old fisherman nodded. "And what happened?" "They solved it themselves." The fisherman dipped one hand into the cool water beside the boat. "Sometimes," he said softly, "our first instinct is not to help. It is to remove uncertainty." He let the water slip gently through his fingers. But life has its own quiet wisdom. Some knots loosen. Only after he stopped pulling. The young man looked toward the boys, now disappearing into the evening light. He imagined how quickly he would have stepped in, how confidently he would have untangled the net. He would have solved the problem. But he also would have taken away the children's chance to discover the answer for themselves. The realization settled gently inside him, like a seed finding fertile ground. He bowed gratefully to the old fisherman. As he continued walking home, the river flowed beside him with its familiar, patient voice. For the first time in many years, he did not search the water for something that needed to be fixed. He simply listened. That evening, the valley settled into one of those rare silences that seem almost sacred. No wind stirred the trees. No voices echoed across the fields. Even the river, though always moving, seemed to whisper instead of sing. The young man sat outside his home with nothing in his hands. No notebook, no measuring rope, no unfinished list waiting for tomorrow. Only the memory of the old fisherman's words. Asterisk, some knots loosen. Only after he stopped pulling. Asterisk. He repeated the sentence quietly to himself. Again, then once more. Each time, it seemed to mean something slightly different. His father stepped outside, carrying 2 small cups of warm tea. Without speaking, he handed one to his son and sat beside him. For several peaceful minutes, they watched the stars appear one by one above the valley. The older man finally smiled. "I haven't seen you sit still like this in a very long time." The young man laughed softly. "I almost forgot how." His father nodded. "It takes practice." The answer surprised him. "I thought being still would be easy." His father looked toward the river. "It is easy for the body." He gently wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "The mind is another matter." The young man followed his father's gaze. "I've tried." "I know." For a few moments today, he hesitated. Everything became quiet. His father waited patiently. Then it disappeared. The older man smiled, as though he had been expecting exactly that answer. "When you first learned to walk," he said gently. "Did you fall?" The young man laughed. "Many times. And yet, you kept walking." The older man took a slow sip of tea. Peace grows the same way. It rarely arrives all at once. It visits. It leaves. Then, if we welcome it kindly each time it returns, it slowly begins staying a little longer. The young man lowered his eyes. Something about those words settled deeply within him. Not because he had fully understood them, because they felt true. At that very moment, a cool breeze moved across the valley. The branches of the willow tree swayed gently beside the river. Somewhere in the darkness, a single leaf let go. It landed upon the water without resistance, neither choosing the current nor resisting it, simply accepting the journey that had already begun. The young man watched until the little leaf disappeared into the night. For reasons he could not explain, he did not wonder where it would end. That alone felt like a small miracle. His father noticed the quiet change in his expression. He said nothing. Some changes become stronger when they are left undisturbed. Far beyond the sleeping valley, clouds were beginning to gather once again above the distant mountains. No one could see them yet, not even the young man. The river, however, already knew they were coming. The clouds arrived so quietly that no one in the valley spoke of them at first. They gathered beyond the mountains like distant travelers, pausing before the final stretch of a long journey. For several days, the air grew heavier. The swallows flew lower over the fields. The scent of rain lingered in the wind long before a single drop had fallen. The young man noticed every sign. He always did. He climbed a ridge before sunrise. He measured the river before breakfast. He walked its banks again before sunset. Everything appeared normal. And yet, something deep within him refused to rest. Not because there was danger, because there might be. That single word, asterisk, had quietly become the master of his days. One afternoon, while tightening a row of wooden stakes along the eastern bank, a young farmer approached with a broad smile. "You've been working since dawn?" The young man nodded. "There's still more to do." The farmer looked around. The bank was solid. The irrigation channels were clear. The pathways had all been repaired. He laughed warmly. "If you keep improving everything, the river won't have anything left to teach us." The young man smiled politely. "But it may still surprise us." The farmer shrugged with the easy confidence of someone who trusted tomorrow. "Perhaps." He looked toward the sky. "Or perhaps tomorrow will simply be another beautiful day." With that, he waved goodbye and continued toward the village, whistling a cheerful tune. The young man watched him disappear along the winding path. For a brief moment, he envied the kind of lightness. He could barely remember what it felt like. As evening approached, the first drops of rain finally began to fall. Soft, scattered, almost gentle enough to go unnoticed. The river welcomed them without changing its rhythm. Tiny circles spread across the surface before quietly fading away. The young man remained where he was, letting the cool rain settle upon his shoulders. Years ago, he would have enjoyed a rain like this. He would have watched the ripples race one another across the water. He might even have laughed. Now, he found himself calculating. If the rain continued through the night, how much would the river rise? If it lasted 2 days, would the northern bank hold? If the mountain streams filled too quickly, which fields would be reached first? One thought became another. Another became 10 more, until the peaceful rain no longer sounded peaceful at all. It sounded like a warning. As darkness slowly covered the valley, he made one final inspection before returning home. Everything was secure. Every stone remained in place. Every channel flowed exactly as planned. Still, as he turned away from the river, he glanced back one last time. Not because anything was wrong, because he could not bring himself to stop checking. Behind him, the river continued flowing through the rain with quiet, ancient patience. It neither promised safety nor threatened disaster. It simply flowed, as it always had, as it always would. Rain continued through the night. Not the violent kind that shakes rooftops or startles people awake. This rain was quieter, steady, patient, the kind that seems almost harmless until morning reveals everything it has quietly changed. Long before sunrise, the young man was already dressed. He stepped outside, carrying a lantern whose warm glow barely reached beyond his feet. The village was still asleep. Only the river seemed awake. Its voice had grown deeper, not alarming, simply fuller than it had been the evening before. He walked quickly along the eastern bank, holding the lantern low enough to study the water. The current had risen only a little, a few inches perhaps, Nothing unusual. Still, he remained there longer than necessary, watching, listening, waiting for a sign that only he believed he might recognize. As dawn slowly brightened the valley, another figure appeared on the path. It was his father. The older man carried no lantern, no tools, only a woven basket with fresh bread tucked beneath a linen cloth. "I thought I might find you here," he said with a gentle smile. The young man returned the smile. "I wanted to check the river." "I know." His father looked across the flowing water. "It seems healthy today." The young man nodded. "It does." Neither of them spoke for a while. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the cedar trees. Mist drifted lazily above the current before dissolving into the morning air. Everything felt peaceful, almost impossibly peaceful. His father broke the silence. "Do you remember when you were a little boy, and you believed every cloud meant a storm?" The young man laughed quietly. "I do. You would run inside and close every window. I wanted to protect the house." His father smiled. "And your mother would always open one window again." The memory returned so clearly that the young man could almost hear his mother's laughter. "She used to say." He paused, smiling to himself. "Fresh air should never be locked outside because of a fear that hasn't arrived." His father nodded. "She was a wise woman." The older man looked toward the river once more. "I've been wondering." "What?" "When did you begin closing the windows inside your own heart?" The question settled gently between them. The young man searched for an answer. He found none. Instead, he looked back at the river. The water continued slipping past without hesitation. It did not cling to yesterday's rain. It did not worry about tomorrow's. It simply welcomed whatever the sky had given it. His father placed the basket on the grass and tore the loaf of bread in half. He handed one piece to his son. "Eat." The young man accepted it. They stood together in comfortable silence, sharing warm bread while watching the river greet another morning. For a few precious minutes, neither of them tried to change anything. Neither of them tried to solve anything. The valley simply existed. And for the first time in many years, the young man wondered whether that had always been enough. Far beyond the mountains, hidden behind layers of pale morning cloud, a larger storm had already begun its slow journey toward the valley. The river felt it long before anyone else. It did not become anxious. It did not prepare. It simply kept flowing. The storm did not arrive that day, nor the day after. Instead, it lingered somewhere beyond the mountains, hidden behind layers of distant cloud. The waiting proved more difficult than the rain itself. Each morning, the young man searched the horizon. Each afternoon, he studied the changing wind. Each evening, he walked the length of the river before returning home. Nothing seemed out of place. The villagers continued living as they always had. Children chased butterflies through the meadows. Fishermen pushed their boats into the quiet current before sunrise. Neighbors gathered beneath the old oak tree, exchanging stories that grew a little longer as the evenings became cooler. Life continued, offering peaceful moments. The young man noticed almost none of them. He was listening for thunder that had not yet spoken. One afternoon, while crossing the old footbridge, he met a young mother walking hand in hand with her little daughter. The child stopped halfway across the bridge and leaned over the railing. "Look," she whispered excitedly. "They're fish." The young man instinctively stepped forward. "Be careful." The little girl smiled and took one small step back without complaint. Her mother thanked him kindly. Then, instead of continuing across the bridge, she stood beside her daughter. Together, they watched the fish gliding through the clear water below. The child laughed. "They don't seem worried about the storm." Her mother smiled. "I don't think they know it's coming." The little girl thought for a moment. "Maybe that's why they're happy." The young man looked down into the river. A school of silver fish drifted effortlessly through the current, turning together as though guided by a single quiet breath. None of them hurried. None of them resisted the water. They simply moved with it. He watched them until they disappeared beneath the shadow of the bridge. Something inside him softened, only a little. As the mother and daughter continued toward the village, the little girl looked back and waved. "I hope you have a beautiful evening." He smiled and waved in return. "You too." The words echoed gently in his mind after they were gone. Asterisk, a beautiful evening. Asterisk, he could not remember the last time he had wished for one. He had wished for stronger riverbanks, safer bridges, healthier harvests, more predictable seasons, but not simply a beautiful evening. He rested both hands upon the weathered railing of the bridge. The wood felt warm beneath the fading sunlight. The river flowed quietly below. For several long breaths, he allowed himself to watch it without measuring, predicting, or planning. The current carried drifting leaves around the bend with effortless grace. One leaf spun briefly in a tiny whirlpool before slipping free again. It did not fight the water. It did not fear the delay. It simply continued its journey. The young man followed it until it disappeared from sight. Behind the western mountains, a faint roll of thunder finally broke the silence. Soft, distant, almost gentle. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the river looked exactly as it had before. Only his heart had begun to understand that another lesson was drawing near. The thunder returned just before dawn. This time, it did not sound distant. It rolled slowly across the mountains, deep enough to stir the windows of sleeping homes before fading once more into the gray morning sky. The young man was already awake. He had not slept much, not because of fear, because of anticipation. He stepped outside as the first drops began to fall. They landed softly upon the wooden steps, upon the quiet roofs, upon the patient river. For a little while, the valley seemed to welcome the rain. Children stretched out their hands beneath the gentle shower. Farmers smiled as they looked toward the thirsty fields. The orchards drank deeply. Everything appeared exactly as it should. The young man wished he could see it that way. Instead, his eyes remained fixed upon the river. By midday, the current had begun to swell. Not dramatically, just enough for him to notice. He walked from one bank to the other, inspecting every place he had repaired over the years. The stone wall near the eastern bend held firm. The irrigation channels carried away excess water exactly as they had been designed to do. The old footbridge remained strong. Each successful inspection brought a brief moment of relief, only to be replaced by another question. Asterisk, what have I forgotten? Asterisk, by late afternoon, rain fell more heavily. The river's voice grew deeper. The familiar stones beneath the surface slowly disappeared beneath rising water. Villagers gathered outside their homes, watching the weather with quiet concern. No one panicked. Storms had always been part of life here. An elderly neighbor noticed the young man hurrying along the riverbank. "You prepared well," he called out. "We'll be all right." The young man smiled politely. "I hope so." Hope. He realized he had not spoken that word in a long time. He had trusted plans. He had trusted measurements. He had trusted careful preparation. Hope had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. As evening approached, the rain showed no sign of stopping. The river pushed harder against its banks. Logs and broken branches rushed downstream, spinning wildly in the growing current. The young man stood in the rain until his clothes were completely soaked. His notebook, protected beneath his cloak, remained dry. Without thinking, he reached inside to make another note. Then he stopped. The pages already contained years of observations, thousands of careful measurements, predictions, sketches, plans. Yet none of those pages could tell him exactly what the river would do before morning. He slowly closed the notebook. For the first time in many years, he had nothing left to measure. Only a river rising beneath a darkening sky, and a heart that was beginning to understand how small it truly was. Far upstream, hidden by rain and gathering darkness, the sound of rushing water grew louder. The river was bringing something with it, not in anger, not in punishment, simply as rivers always have, following the path they were never meant to abandon. The rain continued through the night without a single pause. No lightning split the sky. No fierce winds bent the trees. There was only the endless rhythm of falling water, steady enough to make time itself seem slower. The young man remained beside the river. Several villagers joined him, carrying lanterns whose small flames trembled in the damp air. No one spoke very much. There was little to say. Every pair of eyes rested upon the same rising current. One lantern illuminated the stone wall the young man had built years before. The water pressed against it with growing determination. At first, the wall did exactly what it had been built to do. The current divided around the stones. The bank remained firm. A quiet breath of relief moved through the gathered villagers. "It is holding." Someone smiled. Another whispered, "You were right to build it." The young man wanted to believe those words. He truly did. Then he heard it, a sound so soft that no one else seemed to notice. A single stone shifted beneath the force of the current. Only an inch, perhaps less. But he heard it. He stepped closer. The lantern light flickered across the wet stones. Another low, grinding sound rose from beneath the rushing water. His heart tightened. "Bring more rocks," he said calmly. Quickly, several men hurried toward the hillside. Others filled baskets with loose stones from the riverbank. Working together, they carried them through the rain and placed them along the wall. For a few hopeful moments, the barrier held once again. The young man stood in silence, rain running down his face. He could no longer tell whether the moisture upon his cheeks came from the sky or from the river itself. Then, somewhere upstream, a deep crack echoed through the valley. Everyone froze. The sound was followed by another, then another. The young man lifted his lantern higher. Dark shapes emerged from the rain. Not people, not animals, entire trees. Their roots torn from the mountainside, they surged toward the village, spinning wildly in the swollen current. "Back!" he shouted. Everyone moved back. The first tree struck the stone wall with a heavy thud that shook the ground beneath their feet. The wall held. A second tree crashed into it moments later. Several stones shifted. Water burst through a narrow opening before settling again. The villagers rushed forward with more rocks. The young man knelt in the icy water, pushing the largest stones into place with all the strength he had. His hands slipped, his shoulders strained. Still he pushed. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Years believing that if he worked hard enough, if he planned carefully enough, if he noticed what others overlooked, he could protect the valley. Another tremendous crash split the darkness. This time the river carried not one tree, but three. The current drove them forward with a force no human hands could hope to resist. The young man looked up. For the first time in his life, he saw the river not as something to understand, not as something to improve, but as something infinitely older, infinitely stronger, and utterly beyond his control. The first tree struck the wall with a sound that echoed through the entire valley. For one hopeful heartbeat, the stones held. Then came the second impact. A deep crack spread through the center of the barrier like a line of lightning racing across dark clouds. The young man lunged forward. "No." His voice was almost lost beneath the roar of the river. He dropped to his knees in the freezing water and pressed both hands against the shifting stones, as though the strength of his own body might somehow hold them together. Around him, the villagers hurried with more rocks. Some carried wooden beams. Others dug desperately into the muddy bank, trying to reinforce the weakening wall. No one stopped. No one gave up. Hope has a remarkable way of making us believe that one more effort, one more stone, one more moment will change what has already begun. The young man believed it with every breath. "Here," he shouted. "Put the larger stones here." Several men obeyed immediately. Together, they strained against the current. For an instant, the water seemed to hesitate. The opening narrowed. A few of the villagers smiled. Perhaps they had done enough. Then the river answered, not with anger, not with violence, only with the quiet certainty of something following its own ancient course. The swollen current slipped beneath the lowest stones. The ground beneath the wall, softened by days of rain, began to give way. The young man felt it before he saw it. The earth beneath his knees trembled. His heart seemed to stop. "No." He whispered again. The wall slowly leaned forward. Just enough for the river to find the smallest opening. Once water discovers a path, it rarely asks permission to continue. The narrow stream became a rushing torrent. One stone slipped free, then another. Then half the wall seemed to sigh before collapsing into the roaring current. The sound was not loud. It was strangely gentle, almost peaceful, as though the river had never been fighting the wall at all. It had simply been waiting. The villagers stumbled backward. Some stood frozen. Others lowered the stones they had been carrying, suddenly unsure what to do next. The young man remained where he was. Water rushed around him. The barrier he had spent years imagining, months designing, weeks building, had disappeared in less than a minute. He stared at the empty space where it had stood. His hands still rested upon stones that no longer belonged to a wall. Rain continued falling. The river continued flowing. Nothing in nature celebrated. Nothing in nature apologized. A hand rested gently upon his shoulder. It was his father. Come. The young man did not move. We can still rebuild it. His voice trembled. His father looked quietly at the river. Not tonight. We have to. If we don't. His words broke apart. His father waited patiently before speaking. There are moments when wisdom is knowing what can still be saved. And there are moments when wisdom is stepping away from what cannot. The young man closed his eyes. For years, he had believed surrender was another word for failure. Standing beside the broken wall, he was about to discover that they were not the same thing at all. The young man did not leave. Even after his father gently stepped back to help the other villagers move tools and lanterns to higher ground, he remained beside the broken wall. Rain streamed from his hair. His clothes clung heavily to his shoulders. The cold river pressed against his legs as though urging him to let go. Still, he could not. He picked up one stone, then another. His trembling hands tried to rebuild what the current had already carried away. Each stone slipped. Each handful of mud dissolved between his fingers. The river accepted every effort with the same quiet indifference. Not mocking him, not resisting him, simply continuing. My son. His father's voice came again, softer this time. We have to leave. The young man shook his head. If I stop now. He swallowed hard. Everything I've done for all these years will have meant nothing. His father did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked in the shallow water until he stood beside his son. Together, they watched another section of the bank crumble gently into the current. Neither of them reached for it. Finally, the older man spoke. Do you remember the first twig we placed upon this river? The young man stared silently at the rushing water. You asked me if anyone could stop it. I remember. And do you remember my answer? His voice was almost lost beneath the rain. You said we were given many things to care for. He paused, but very few things to control. His father nodded. I've spent many years hoping those words would find you when you needed them most. The young man's shoulders began to tremble. Not from the cold, from the weight he had been carrying for so many years. I failed. The words escaped him before he could stop them. I told everyone the wall would hold. I believed it would. I should have built it stronger. I should have seen this coming. I should have. His voice broke. For the first time since he was a child, he no longer sounded like the man everyone depended upon. He sounded like a frightened son. His father turned toward him. Rain ran slowly down the older man's weathered face. You did not fail because the wall fell. The young man looked at him with exhausted eyes. You failed only if you believe a river was ever yours to command. Silence settled between them. Not the silence of peace. The silence that follows a truth too large to enter the heart all at once. Behind them, the villagers called for everyone to move farther uphill. The river had already begun spilling into the lowest fields. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness like distant stars. Voices carried across the rain. Children were being led safely toward higher ground. Neighbors were helping one another without hesitation. The young man looked back. No one was blaming him. No one shouted in anger. No one accused him of failing. The only person still standing in judgment was himself. He lowered his eyes to the river one last time. The broken stones had already disappeared beneath the current. It was as though the wall had never existed. The river remembered only one thing: to keep flowing. Slowly, very slowly, the young man released the final stone from his hands. It slipped into the water without a sound. For the first time in many years, he stopped trying to hold the river back. And together with his father, he turned away from the current and began walking toward the people who still needed him. The climb to higher ground was slow, not because the path was difficult, because everyone stopped to help someone else. One man carried an elderly neighbor whose knees had grown too weak for the steep hillside. Two sisters wrapped dry blankets around shivering children before covering themselves. A farmer returned to untie frightened animals trapped behind a flooded fence. No one asked whose responsibility it was. They simply helped. The young man walked among them in silence. For years, he had believed that protecting the village meant controlling the river. Tonight, the village was teaching him something entirely different. Protection did not always begin with stopping disaster. Sometimes it began with refusing to leave one another behind. When they finally reached the old temple overlooking the valley, dawn was still several hours away. The small wooden building had stood upon that hillside for generations. Storm after storm had passed beneath it. Flood after flood had flowed through the valley below. Its lanterns glowed warmly against the darkness, welcoming every weary traveler who arrived. Inside, villagers quietly gathered around small fires. Someone brewed hot tea. Someone else prepared simple bowls of rice. Wet clothes were exchanged for dry blankets. Children who had been frightened only an hour before slowly fell asleep against their parents' shoulders. The young man remained near the doorway. His eyes never left the valley below. The river, swollen by days of rain, shimmered beneath the occasional flash of distant lightning. He could still see the place where the wall had stood. Or rather, the place where it no longer stood. A calm voice spoke beside him. "You build it with great care." The young man turned. Standing there was an elderly monk. His robes were simple. Rain had darkened the edges of the worn fabric. His face carried deep lines, not of worry, but of many years spent smiling gently at the world. The young man bowed respectfully. "I am sorry." The word surprised even him. The monk tilted his head slightly. "For what?" "For failing." The monk looked toward the river. "It is still flowing." "Yes." "And the people?" The young man glanced behind him. Families rested safely inside the temple. Soft conversations drifted through the warm room. Children slept peacefully despite the storm outside. "They are safe." The monk nodded. "Then perhaps tonight is not only a story of what was lost." The young man remained silent. The monk stepped closer to the doorway. Together, they listened to the rain for several moments. Then the old monk asked a question so quietly that it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the storm. "Tell me, when the wall collapsed, what hurt you the most?" The young man answered without thinking. "I cannot stop the river." The monk waited. After a long silence, he asked another question. "And if you had stopped it?" The young man frowned. "What do you mean?" The monk smiled gently. "If you had truly possessed the power to command every river, every season, every storm." He looked directly into the young man's weary eyes. "Would you still know how to trust life?" The question settled into the silence between them. For the first time that night, the young man found no answer at all. The old monk did not wait for an answer. Some questions are too gentle to demand one. Instead, he walked quietly toward the temple porch and sat upon the smooth wooden steps. The young man followed. Below them, the valley rested beneath the rain. The river could still be heard, though it was hidden by darkness and mist. For a long while, they simply listened. The young man expected another lesson, another wise saying, another explanation that would somehow make the pain easier to carry. None came, only silence. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. His thoughts rushed to fill it. The broken wall, the flooded fields, the years of work, the promises he believed he had failed to keep. One memory after another rose and disappeared like leaves drifting upon the current. The monk remained perfectly still. His breathing was slow, gentle, almost in harmony with the falling rain. After several minutes, the old man reached into the sleeve of his robe and removed a small clay bowl. It was old. One side had been carefully repaired with a thin line of dark lacquer. The crack was still visible. The bowl was not perfect, yet it was clearly cherished. The monk placed it between them. "What do you see?" The young man answered immediately. "A broken bowl." The monk smiled. "I see a bowl that still holds tea." He poured a little warm tea into it from a nearby kettle. Not a single drop escaped. The monk lifted the bowl with both hands and offered it to the young man. He accepted it carefully. The tea was warm against his cold fingers. Comforting. Alive. "You noticed the crack first," the monk said softly. The young man lowered his eyes. "I suppose I did." "You have trained your mind well." The words sounded almost like praise. Then the monk continued. "It has become very skilled at finding what is damaged." The young man looked at the bowl again. The crack was still there, but so was the tea. So was the warmth. So was the purpose. The old monk watched the rain for a few moments before speaking again. Many people spend their lives trying to become unbreakable. He shook his head gently. But rivers polish stones by allowing them to meet the current. He looked toward the darkness where the river flowed unseen. Our hearts are polished the same way. The young man closed his eyes. For years, every conversation, every lesson, every gentle piece of wisdom had seemed to point toward something he could never quite understand. Tonight, for the first time, the words were no longer passing around his heart. They were beginning to enter it. He wrapped both hands around the warm bowl, not to hold it tightly, simply to feel its warmth. The rain continued falling. The river continued flowing. And somewhere within the quiet space between those two endless sounds, the first small crack appeared, not in the wall he had built beside the river, but in the belief that he had carried inside himself for so many years. The night slowly surrendered to morning. Rain still fell, though its voice had softened. The fierce urgency of the storm had passed, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of water finding its way through the valley. One by one, the villagers began stepping outside the temple. No one rushed. There was nothing to be gained by hurrying now. The young man walked with them down the hillside. His boots sank gently into the wet earth. Mist drifted above the fields, hiding some places while revealing others. The familiar valley looked different. Not ruined. Different. Several fences had been carried away. A narrow footpath had disappeared beneath fresh mud. The lower fields lay beneath a shallow blanket of water that reflected the pale morning sky. He felt the familiar weight beginning to return. Asterisk, where should I begin? Asterisk. Asterisk, what should be repaired first? Asterisk. Asterisk, how long will everything take? Asterisk. Before those thoughts could gather their usual strength, he noticed something unexpected. The villagers had already begun helping one another, without waiting for instructions, without asking permission. One family cleared branches from neighbor's doorway. Two fishermen steadied a damaged footbridge while a carpenter examined its supports. Children gathered scattered firewood, laughing each time they found another dry piece hidden beneath the leaves. No one seemed to be waiting for him to tell them what to do. Life was already moving, quietly, naturally, just as the river always had. The young man stood in silence. For years, he had believed that if he ever stopped carrying everything, everything would fall apart. Yet here was the valley, bruised, a little weary, and already healing itself. The old monk appeared beside him once more. They seem to know what they're doing. The young man nodded slowly. They do. The monk smiled. Did they suddenly become wise overnight? A faint smile touched the young man's face. No, they've always known how to help one another. The monk looked across the valley. Then, perhaps, he paused, allowing the morning breeze to finish the thought. The burden you carried was never entirely yours. The young man's eyes filled with quiet tears. Not tears of sorrow, not even relief. Something gentler, like ice melting after a very long winter. He watched an elderly woman hand a loaf of fresh bread to a family whose oven had been flooded. A young shepherd carried water to workers repairing a broken fence. Someone began singing. Soon another voice joined, then another. No one had planned it. No one had organized it. The song simply appeared, the way birds greet the sunrise. The young man realized he had spent years believing that strength meant standing in front of everyone. The valley was showing him another kind of strength, standing beside them. He took a slow breath, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The sound of the river no longer felt like a challenge. It sounded almost like a friend calling him home. The work of restoring the valley continued for many days. Yet something had quietly changed. Not the river, not the weather. The young man. Before the storm, he had walked through every task as though the entire valley rested upon his shoulders. Now, he began walking beside others instead of ahead of them. When a fence needed rebuilding, he picked up a hammer rather than giving instructions. When fallen trees blocked the road, he lifted them alongside the farmers instead of planning every movement himself. He still worked hard, perhaps harder than ever, but there was a difference that could not be measured. He no longer worked from fear. He worked from love. One afternoon, while repairing a small footbridge with the old carpenter, he noticed something unusual about himself. A loose plank slipped from his hands and splashed into the shallow water below. Months earlier, he would have sighed in frustration. He would have blamed himself for being careless. He would have replayed the mistake for the rest of the day. Instead, he laughed. The sound surprised them both. The carpenter looked over and smiled. "What happened? I dropped it. I can see that." The old man chuckled. "But why are you smiling?" The young man looked at the drifting plank. It floated. The carpenter laughed with him. Yes, it did. Together, they climbed down to retrieve it. The current had carried it only a short distance before gently resting it against a smooth stone. As they lifted it from the water, the carpenter spoke without looking up. "You know, I've been waiting many years to hear you laugh beside this river." The young man paused. "Many years?" The carpenter nodded. "You used to, when you were little. Then one day, you stopped." Neither of them spoke for a while. The bridge slowly took shape beneath their hands. Hammer, nail, board, silence. The rhythm itself felt peaceful. At sunset, they sat together upon the finished bridge. The carpenter stretched his tired legs and looked toward the glowing horizon. "Tell me something." The young man smiled. "What is it? When you look at the river now, what do you see?" The question would once have been easy. A weak bank, a damaged crossing, a future repair. Today, he watched the golden light dancing upon the current. He watched two children chasing dragonflies through the reeds. He watched an elderly couple walking hand in hand along the opposite shore. Then he answered, "I see life." The carpenter's smile widened. "And does life still need repairing?" The young man thought carefully. Then he shook his head. "Sometimes." He looked back toward the flowing water. "But most of the time, it simply asks to be lived." The evening breeze carried the scent of cedar across the bridge. The river continued its endless journey toward the sea. It had not changed. Only the eyes that were looking at it had. A few evenings later, the young man returned to the place where the stone wall had once stood. Very little remained. The river had long since carried away the scattered rocks. Fresh grass had already begun pushing through the softened earth. If a traveler had passed that way for the first time, they would never have guessed that so many years of effort had once rested there. He stood quietly upon the bank. The setting sun covered the valley in warm shades of gold and amber. The current moved with the same calm patience it had shown on the day he first stood beside it as a child. He smiled to himself. "It doesn't even remember." A gentle voice answered from behind him. "Oh, it remembers." The old monk approached slowly, carrying nothing more than his familiar walking staff. The young man bowed respectfully. "I thought the river had erased everything." The monk looked across the flowing water. "The river forgets nothing. It simply refuses to cling to anything." The words settled into the quiet evening like falling leaves. Together, they watched the current for several moments. The monk pointed toward a smooth stone resting near the center of the river. "Do you see that stone? Ido. When do you think it became so smooth?" The young man studied it carefully. "It must have taken many years." The monk nodded. The river never argued with the stone. It never demanded that the stone change. It simply touched it. He smiled gently. Day after day, The young man felt something inside him soften once again. So even the river teaches with patience. The monk chuckled. How else could anything truly be learned? A flock of white birds rose gracefully from the reeds, circling once above the water before disappearing toward the western hills. The young man followed them until they vanished into the evening sky. I spent so many years believing I had to become stronger than the river. The monk's eyes remained upon the current. And now, the young man breathed deeply. Now I think I only needed to become quieter. The old monk smiled, though he said nothing. Some truths become complete the moment we speak them aloud. The evening breeze drifted gently through the willow branches. A single leaf loosened from its stem and landed softly upon the water. The young man watched it float away. This time, he did not wonder where it would end. He did not imagine the rocks it might meet. He did not wish to guide its journey. He simply watched until it disappeared around the familiar bend. Then, almost without thinking, he whispered, "Safe travels." The monk heard him. A warm smile crossed the old man's face. That may be the kindest prayer we can ever offer. The young man looked toward the endless river. For the first time since he was a little boy, he felt no desire to change its course. He felt only gratitude that it had never changed his. The valley slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. New fences replaced the old ones. Fresh grass covered the places where the flood had left its mark. Children once again filled the riverbank with laughter, as though the storm had become nothing more than another story carried away by time. Life had not returned because everything was repaired. Life had returned because life had never truly stopped. One quiet morning, the young man found himself walking beside the river before sunrise. It was a habit he had kept for many years. Yet this morning felt different. For the first time, he had no destination. No section of bank waiting to be inspected. No measurements to record. No list folded carefully inside his robe. Only the gentle sound of flowing water. The eastern sky slowly brightened. A thin veil of mist hovered above the river, glowing softly beneath the first rays of dawn. He stopped beneath the old willow tree. Its roots reached deeply into the earth. Its branches stretched peacefully across the water. He remembered standing here as a child beside his father. He remembered the first twig they had placed upon the current. He remembered the promise he had whispered to the river. Asterisk, one day, I will make you listen. Asterisk, a quiet smile touched his face. What a frightened little boy you were. The words were spoken with tenderness. Not regret, not shame, only compassion. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The river did not sound different. The birds had not changed their songs. The breeze still carried the scent of cedar through the valley. Everything outside him seemed exactly as it had always been. Only the noise within him had begun to fade. He realized something so simple that it almost made him laugh. The river had never been his greatest struggle. His own fear had been. The fear of losing. The fear of failing. The fear that love required him to prevent every sorrow before it arrived. He breathed in slowly, then released the breath just as gently. The river continued flowing, not asking him to become wiser, not asking him to become stronger, only inviting him to walk beside it instead of standing in its way. A family of ducks glided peacefully through the morning light. One tiny duckling drifted slightly behind the others before quickly finding its way again. The mother duck never turned back. She did not panic. She simply kept moving with quiet confidence, trusting the little one to follow. The young man watched until they disappeared around the bend. Then he bowed toward the river, not because he worshipped it, because he finally understood. Some teachers never speak a single word, yet they spend an entire lifetime showing us how to live. As the sun rose above the mountains, warm light spread across the valley once more. The young man turned from the river and began walking toward the village, not to control what the day would bring, but to greet it, one peaceful step at a time. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. Not to the river, not to the valley, to the spaces between the young man's thoughts. They grew quieter, not empty, simply quieter. The old habits did not disappear overnight. There were still mornings when he instinctively searched the riverbank for signs of trouble. Still evenings when his mind wandered toward tomorrow before today had fully ended. But now, he noticed, and noticing, he discovered, was the beginning of freedom. One cool spring morning, he found himself standing beside the water with his notebook in his hands. For a long while, he stared at its worn leather cover. The corners had softened with age. Its pages carried years of careful handwriting. Measurements, sketches, predictions, questions. It had accompanied him through almost every season of his adult life. He slowly opened it. The very first page held the crooked drawing he had made as a child. The little river, the willow tree, the tiny figure sitting happily beside the water. He smiled. The child in the drawing had owned nothing, controlled nothing, understood almost nothing about the world. And yet, he looked completely at peace. The young man closed the notebook. He carried it to the riverbank. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he should throw it into the water. The thought passed as quickly as it had arrived. The notebook had never been the problem. It was only paper, only ink. The burden had never rested inside those pages. It had rested inside the story he kept telling himself, that he alone must always know, always predict, always protect. He sat beneath the willow tree and opened the notebook one last time. Instead of writing another measurement, he wrote only a single sentence. Asterisk, today, I remembered to listen. Asterisk. He read the words once, then gently closed the book. No triumph, no ceremony. Just a quiet ending to a chapter that had lasted many years. As he stood to leave, a little boy came running toward the river carrying a homemade paper boat. The child recognized him immediately. Sir. The young man smiled. Good morning. I'm going to race my boat. He held up the tiny paper boat with great pride. Do you think it will make it around the bend? The old version of himself would have examined the current, measured the wind, considered every possibility. Today, he knelt so his eyes met the child's. I don't know. The boy blinked. You don't? The young man smiled even more warmly. No, but I think it's going to have a wonderful journey. The little boy laughed with delight. Without another question, he placed the paper boat upon the water. Together, they watched it drift away. Neither of them tried to steer it. Neither of them ran along the bank to protect it. They simply stood together, smiling as the river carried it toward whatever waited beyond the bend. For reasons the young man could not fully explain, watching that little paper boat disappear filled him with more peace than all the walls he had ever built. As the seasons continued their gentle dance across the valley, people slowly began noticing the change in the young man. Not because he worked less. He still rose early. He still helped repair bridges after storms. He still walked the river from time to time. But something about his presence had become different. Years before, people sought him because he always seemed to have the answers. Now, they sought him because they felt calmer after speaking with him. One afternoon, a worried father arrived at his small garden, carrying a troubled expression. My son wishes to leave the valley. The young man invited him to sit beneath the shade of the old willow tree. The father sighed deeply. He says there's a larger world beyond these mountains. He wants to travel. He wants to learn. The man's hands trembled slightly as they rested upon his knees. I am afraid. The young man listened without interrupting. He remembered another time in his own life when he would have begun offering solutions immediately. Today, he simply allowed the silence to make room for the father's heart. After several moments, the man looked up. What should I do? The young man smiled gently. Instead of answering, he pointed toward the river. At that very moment, a mother duck guided her ducklings across the current. The smallest one drifted a little farther away than the others. The father watched anxiously. So close. The duckling disappeared briefly behind a cluster of reeds. The father leaned forward. Shouldn't she go after it? The young man said nothing. A few heartbeats later, the little duckling emerged from the other side of the reeds and hurried back toward its family. The mother duck had never panicked. She had simply continued swimming. The father let out a long breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The young man finally spoke. Love walks beside. It does not always walk in front. The father remained quiet. His eyes stayed on the river. My own father tried to keep me close. The young man continued softly. He loved me very much. I know that now. He smiled. But there were journeys only I could take. The father nodded slowly. So there will be journeys only my son can take. There will. The breeze carried a few willow leaves onto the water. They drifted away together. None tried to remain attached to the branch that had given them life. The father watched until they disappeared around the familiar bend. When he finally stood to leave, the worry upon his face had not vanished completely. No conversation could erase a parent's love, but it had become lighter, more spacious. Before walking away, he turned back. I came here hoping for advice. The young man smiled. I'm afraid I didn't give you much. The father laughed quietly. You gave me something better. What was that? A little more room to trust. The young man watched him disappear along the winding path. Then he turned toward the river. Once, he had believed wisdom meant always knowing the right answer. Now he understood. Sometimes wisdom begins the moment we stop trying to control someone else's journey. As the years quietly unfolded, the young man became one of the elders of the valley. No ceremony marked the change. No title was ever given. It simply happened the way dawn becomes morning, one gentle moment at a time. Children who had once raised paper boats beside him were now grown. Some had families of their own. Others had traveled beyond the mountains and later returned with stories from distant villages. Whenever they came home, they almost always visited the river. And more often than not, they found a young man there, not measuring, not repairing, simply sitting beneath the willow tree. One bright afternoon, a young woman approached him carrying a sleeping baby wrapped in a soft linen blanket. She lowered herself carefully onto the grass beside him. For a while, they watched the river without speaking. Finally, she whispered, I don't know if I'm doing this right. The young man looked at the sleeping child. What makes you think that? She smiled nervously. I worry all the time. What if she becomes sick? What if I make the wrong choices? What if I fail her? The questions poured from her heart like water finding its own path. The young man recognized every one of them. Years ago, they had been his constant companions. He looked down at the tiny child sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. One tiny hand rested outside the blanket. Its fingers opened and closed as though trying to grasp the warm afternoon air. The young man smiled. When she learns to walk, he said softly, will you fall for her? The young mother laughed. Of course not. Why? Because she has to learn. And if she cries, I'll comfort her. And then I'll let her try again. The young man nodded. You already understand. She frowned slightly. Ido. You don't protect a child by removing every fall. You protect a child by becoming a safe place to return after each one. Tears quietly filled the young mother's eyes. She looked down at her sleeping daughter. I've been so afraid. I know. So was I. The words escaped almost as a whisper. For a moment, he saw himself again. A frightened young man standing before a river he believed he had to master. A boy who mistook constant control for endless love. The memory no longer carried pain, only compassion. The baby stirred gently, opening her eyes for just a moment before smiling in her sleep. The young mother laughed through her tears. She smiled. The young man looked toward the river. So does life. Quite often, we're just too busy worrying to notice. They both sat in silence. The river flowed beside them with the same patient song it had sung through every season of his life. This time, neither of them felt the need to interrupt it. They simply listened. And somehow, that felt like enough. One autumn evening, many years later, the young man climbed the same hillside where he had once stood searching for signs of danger. The path felt familiar beneath his feet. The cedar trees still whispered in the evening breeze. The valley stretched before him just as it always had. And yet, everything looked different. Or perhaps, it was he who had changed. He reached the top of the hill just as the sun began slipping behind the distant mountains. Golden light poured across the fields. The river reflected the sky so perfectly that it seemed to carry the sunset through the heart of the valley. He stood there without speaking, Long ago, this very place had been his lookout. From here he had searched for weak riverbanks, dark clouds, broken bridges, anything that might threaten tomorrow. Now, his eyes wandered across the same valley. A farmer returning home with an empty cart after a long day's work. Children waving to one another across the fields. Smoke rising gently from evening fires. Birds finding their nests before nightfall. The river. Always the river. He smiled. Nothing had become perfect. One bridge still leaned a little to one side. Several trees bore the scars of old storms. The western field remained smaller than it had been before the great flood years ago. Life still carried its imperfections. Yet somehow, it also carried enough. A familiar voice interrupted the quiet. "What do you see?" The young man turned. The old monk had joined him once again. His steps had grown slower with age. His hair, what little remained beneath his simple hood, had become completely white. The young man bowed warmly. "I see the valley." The monk smiled. "I know, but what do you really see?" The young man looked once more across the landscape. This time he did not hurry. He allowed the silence to settle first. Then he answered, "I see a place that never needed me to make it perfect." He paused. "It only asked me to love it while I was here." The old monk closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though silently giving thanks. When he opened them again, they shone with quiet joy. "You have finally stopped trying to improve the sunset." The young man laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed gently across the hillside. The monk laughed with him. Neither of them explained the joke. Neither of them needed to. Some wisdom cannot be translated into words. It can only be recognized by another peaceful heart. The evening breeze carried a handful of crimson leaves into the air. They circled slowly above the valley before settling wherever the wind invited them. The young man watched every one of them. Not a single leaf landed where he expected. Every one landed exactly where it belonged. And for the first time in his life, he found those two truths to be exactly the same. As the years continued their quiet journey, the young man found himself returning less often to the river and more often to the people, not because he loved the river any less, because he had finally discovered what the river had been trying to teach him all along: flow toward life. One crisp winter afternoon, the village children gathered outside the old temple after their lessons. Snow had dusted the distant mountain peaks, though the valley itself remained touched only by cool winds and pale sunlight. The children sat in a wide circle around the young man. Some held warm cups of tea. Others clutched little pieces of bread still fresh from the ovens. One curious boy raised his hand. "Is it true that you once tried to stop the river?" The other children turned toward him with wide eyes. The young man smiled. "I did." "Why?" The question was so innocent that it carried no judgment, only wonder. He looked toward the river, visible through the temple pines. "When I was young, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I became wise enough, if I planned carefully enough, I could protect everyone from pain." The children listened without making a sound. A little girl tilted her head. "Can anyone do that?" The young man smiled gently. "No." "Then were you sad?" He laughed softly. "Oh yes, for a very long time." The children looked at one another. One little boy frowned thoughtfully. "But if you couldn't stop the river, how do you help people now?" The young man remained quiet for several heartbeats. The answer arrived not from his thoughts, but from years he had spent learning to let those thoughts become still. "I remind them," he said softly, "that they don't have to carry tomorrow by themselves." The children seemed to consider this very carefully. One girl looked confused. "But tomorrow isn't heavy." The young man laughed again. "No, it isn't. Our worries are." The children burst into quiet giggles. To them, the answer felt wonderfully simple. Perhaps because children have not yet learned to make life as complicated as adults often do. The temple bell rang softly in the distance. The lesson for the day had ended. The children thanked him and hurried back toward the village, their laughter echoing across the winter air. The young man remained seated beneath the old pine tree. The old monk, who had been quietly sweeping fallen leaves nearby, smiled without looking up. You've become quite a teacher." The young man shook his head. "I don't think so." The monk rested the broom against the temple wall. "Why not?" The young man looked toward the children disappearing down the hill. "I've stopped trying to teach." The monk's smile widened. "And what do you do instead?" The young man watched the river flowing peacefully through the valley below. "I simply tell them where I got lost, so they might recognize the path a little sooner than I did." The old monk bowed his head with quiet gratitude. Somewhere below, the river continued its endless song, never explaining, never persuading, simply flowing, exactly as the greatest teachers always have. One spring morning, many years after the Great Flood, the young man awoke before sunrise for no particular reason. The valley was still wrapped in the soft blue light that comes just before dawn. Everything was quiet, not silent, alive in the gentlest possible way. He stepped outside without shoes, letting the cool grass welcome his feet. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth, cedar, and the first blossoms of the season. For a few moments, he simply stood there, breathing, nothing more. The old habit of checking the river did not appear. The old list of unfinished tasks did not arrive. Instead, he noticed the sound of a single bird greeting the coming day. Then another answered from somewhere deeper within the trees. Soon the entire valley awakened, one quiet song at a time. He smiled. So this, he thought, is what mornings have always sounded like. He followed the familiar path to the river, not because something needed his attention, because an old friend was waiting. Mist floated gently above the current. The willow tree stretched its branches over the water exactly as it had for decades. Its trunk had grown thicker. Its bark carried the marks of countless seasons. It reminded him of his own life, not untouched by storms, beautiful because of them. He rested one hand against the rough bark. "Thank you," he whispered. He was not entirely sure whether he was speaking to the tree, the river, the valley, or life itself. Perhaps it did not matter. A small ripple disturbed the still surface. A fish rose briefly before disappearing once more beneath the water. The circles widened, then slowly faded away. Watching them, he remembered something the old monk had once said. Asterisk, the river never argues with the stone. Asterisk, how many years had he argued with life itself? How many peaceful moments had slipped quietly past while he was busy negotiating with tomorrow? He laughed softly. The questions no longer carried regret, only understanding. The breeze lifted a handful of white blossoms from the nearby orchard. They drifted lazily through the morning air before settling upon the river. Some floated together, some wandered apart. None seemed concerned about which path the current would choose. The young man watched until the last blossom disappeared around the bend. Then he sat beneath the willow tree. No meditation, no special practice, no great revelation. Only a man, a river, and another beautiful morning they were quietly sharing together. Sometimes he realized peace does not arrive because life finally becomes still. Peace arrives because we finally stop asking it to be something other than what it already is. The sun slowly rose above the mountains. Warm light spilled across the valley. Another ordinary day had begun, and somehow that felt like the greatest blessing of all. One afternoon, as golden sunlight drifted lazily across the valley, the young man found himself sitting beneath the willow tree with no purpose beyond enjoying the day. Years ago, such an afternoon would have felt wasteful. Now, it felt complete. A gentle breeze carried the laughter of children across the fields. Somewhere nearby, a shepherd played a quiet melody on a wooden flute. The notes rose into the air, wandered over the river, and slowly dissolved into the distant hills. Nothing hurried them. Nothing held them back. Just then, a familiar face appeared along the path. It was the old traveler with the patient horse. His beard had become whiter, his steps a little slower. The horse, too, had grown older, its muzzle touched with silver. Yet both still carried the peaceful look of those who had spent many years trusting the road. The traveler smiled the moment he recognized the young man. "It has been a long journey." The young man rose and embraced him warmly. "It has. And yet, The traveler laughed softly. Somehow the river still remembers us. They sat together beneath the willow tree. For a while, they watched the current in comfortable silence. Finally, the traveler spoke. I've crossed many rivers since we last met. The young man listened. Some were wide. Some were narrow. Some were calm. Some nearly carried me away. He rested a weathered hand upon his walking staff. When I was younger, I thought every river was standing between me and where I wanted to go. He smiled toward the flowing water. Now I know. They were part of the journey itself. The young man nodded slowly. I used to think that too. The traveler looked at him with gentle curiosity. And what do you believe now? The young man watched a dragonfly hovering above the reeds. I think. He paused, allowing the answer to arrive in its own time. That every river I've crossed was really teaching me how to cross my own heart. The traveler closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though savoring the words. That is a long lesson. It is. Worth learning. The young man smiled. Worth every storm. They both laughed quietly. The old horse wandered toward the river's edge and lowered its head to drink. After a few peaceful moments, it lifted its head again, perfectly satisfied. It had taken only what it needed. Nothing more. The traveler noticed the young man watching. My old friend has become wiser than I have. The young man smiled. How so? He never worries whether there will be another river tomorrow. The two men sat together until the shadows began growing longer across the valley. When it was finally time to part, the traveler climbed slowly into his saddle. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. I hope your road is peaceful. The young man looked toward the winding river, then back at his old friend. I no longer hope for that. The traveler raised an eyebrow. What do you hope for instead? The young man's smile grew even gentler. I hope I remember how to walk peacefully, whatever road life places beneath my feet. The traveler tipped his hat. Then, with one final wave, he disappeared slowly down the winding path. The river continued flowing beside them both, as faithful to the traveler as it had always been to the boy who once dreamed of controlling it. And perhaps that had been its greatest kindness all along. The years continued to pass with the quiet grace that only nature seems to understand. The willow tree grew broader. The children of the valley became parents. The parents slowly became grandparents. And the young man, though the villagers still called him by that familiar name, had begun to walk with the gentle pace of someone who no longer wished to arrive anywhere too quickly. One cool evening, he wandered to the highest hill overlooking the valley. It was the same hill where, long ago, he had searched the horizon for storms. Now, he climbed it for a different reason, to watch the sunset. Nothing more. The climb was slower than it had once been. He paused several times along the path, not because he was tired, because every pause revealed something beautiful. A patch of wildflowers dancing in a breeze. A butterfly resting upon a weathered stone. The distant laughter of children carried upward by the wind. Years ago, he would have walked past them all. His eyes would have remained fixed upon the clouds, upon the river, upon tomorrow. At last, he reached the top. The valley opened before him like an old friend smiling from across the years. The river wound gently through the fields, reflecting the fading light of the setting sun. The orchards glowed with the soft colors of early evening. Thin trails of smoke rose peacefully from chimneys where families were preparing their evening meals. He stood there for a long time, not searching, simply seeing. He suddenly remembered a question the old monk had once asked him. Asterisk, if you could command every storm, would you still know how to trust life? Asterisk. He smiled. Back then, he had searched desperately for the right answer. Now, the question itself had quietly disappeared. Trust was no longer something he needed to think about. It had become the way he walked, the way he listened, the way he greeted each morning without demanding to know what it would bring. A soft breeze brushed against his face. He closed his eyes. For one long, peaceful breath, he felt the warmth of the setting sun upon his skin. He heard the river below, the birds returning home, the whisper of cedar branches behind him. None of those sounds asked anything of him. None expected him to improve them. They simply welcomed him into the evening. He opened his eyes once more. The first star had already appeared above the western mountains. Then another, and another. The sky slowly filled with quiet lights. He realized that stars had always arrived this way, one at a time, never hurried, never late. Peace, he thought, had come to his own heart the very same way. Not through one great moment, not through one perfect lesson, but through countless small moments, each one gently inviting him to let go of just one more unnecessary burden. He smiled toward the river far below, then whispered into the cool, evening air, "Thank you for never becoming the river I wanted." The breeze carried his words across the valley. The river answered as it always had, by continuing to flow. One final spring arrived more quietly than all the others. The valley welcomed it with blossoming orchards, singing birds, and the gentle fragrance of fresh rain carried upon the morning breeze. The man, now old enough that children instinctively reached for his hand when crossing the footbridge, walked more slowly than he once had. Yet his heart felt lighter than it ever had. Each morning, he visited the river, not because the river needed him, because gratitude did. He would sit beneath the old willow tree with a small cup of warm tea resting beside him. Sometimes he watched the sunlight dancing across the water. Sometimes he closed his eyes and simply listened. On other mornings, he did nothing at all, and somehow, those mornings always seemed the fullest. One day, a little girl approached him carrying a paper boat carefully folded from a single sheet of cream-colored paper. She held it with both hands as though it were a great treasure. "My grandfather said," she whispered shyly, "that you know this river better than anyone." The old man smiled. "I've known it for a very long time." She looked toward the flowing water. "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "My boat might sink." He looked at the tiny paper boat, then at the hopeful face before him. "What if it does?" The little girl frowned. "Then my journey ends." He shook his head gently. "No." He pointed toward the river. "The boat's journey may end." He rested a hand lightly over her heart. "But yours will continue." The little girl thought about that for a long moment. Then she smiled. Together they knelt beside the water. She placed the tiny paper boat upon the current. For a few moments it floated perfectly. Then it turned slowly, caught a gentle breeze, and drifted toward the center of the river. The little girl clapped happily. "It's going." "Yes, it is." They watched until the boat disappeared around the familiar bend. Neither of them ran after it. Neither of them tried to rescue it from the current. When it could no longer be seen, the little girl looked up. "Do you think it will be all right?" The old man looked toward the endless river stretching beyond the valley. Then he smiled with the peaceful certainty that had taken him an entire lifetime to discover. "I think," he said softly, "it already is." The little girl squeezed his hand before skipping happily back toward the village. The old man remained beneath the willow tree. The breeze stirred its branches above him. A few blossoms drifted silently onto the water. He watched them go. There was no sadness in watching them leave, only quiet appreciation that they had been there at all. The river continued flowing toward places he would never see, and for the first time in his life, that mystery felt wonderfully beautiful. He closed his eyes. The warm sunlight rested gently upon his face. The birds sang without asking to be heard. The river flowed without asking to be understood. And his heart, at long last, had learned to do the very same. As evening gently settled over the valley, the old man found himself returning to the river one last time before the stars appeared. There was no reason, no task waiting to be finished, no promise to keep, only a quiet invitation that seemed to rise from the flowing water itself. The willow tree welcomed him with familiar shade. Its branches swayed softly above the place where he had spent so many seasons of his life. He lowered himself slowly onto the grass. Age had made every movement gentler, not weaker, simply gentler. The river moved with its timeless rhythm, a rhythm he had once tried to understand, then tried to master, and finally had learned simply to accompany. The evening breeze carried the scent of cedar, wildflowers, and fresh water. Somewhere across the valley, a temple bell rang once. Its single note floated through the air before quietly disappearing into the vast silence that followed. The old man smiled. There had been a time when he believed silence meant the absence of sound. Now he knew better. Silence was the place where every sound belonged without competing with another. He closed his eyes. The river, the wind, the birds preparing for night, the distant laughter of a family sharing their evening meal. None interrupted the others. Each completed the whole. A young monk from the temple happened to be walking along the riverside path. Seeing the old man resting beneath the willow tree, he approached respectfully. "May I sit with you?" The old man opened his eyes and nodded warmly. Of course. For several minutes they shared the quiet without speaking. The young monk finally asked, "Master?" The old man laughed softly. "I have never been anyone's master." The young monk smiled. "Then let me ask an old friend." The old man nodded. "What is it?" "If you could return to the day you first stood beside this river as a frightened little boy, what would you tell him?" The old man looked across the flowing water. The question rested gently inside him. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched a single leaf drifting peacefully downstream. Then he smiled. "I would place my hand upon his shoulder." His voice became almost a whisper. "And I would tell him, you do not have to hold the river together. It already knows how to flow." The young monk lowered his head. The words were simple, yet they carried the quiet weight of an entire lifetime. The sun slipped behind the mountains. Soft shades of blue and silver settled across the valley. The first evening stars appeared above the river. The old man looked up at them with the same wonder he had once reserved only for tomorrow. Now, this moment was enough. Completely, wonderfully, enough. Night settled softly across the valley. One by one, the windows of the little homes began glowing with warm golden light. The river reflected each tiny lantern for only a moment before gently carrying its reflection away. The old man remained beneath the willow tree. The young monk sat quietly beside him. Neither of them felt any need to fill the silence. After a while, the young monk asked, "Do you ever wish you had understood all of this sooner?" The old man smiled. For a long time, he watched the moon slowly rising above the eastern hills before answering. "There was a time when I wished exactly that." He chuckled softly. "I imagined all the years I could have saved, the worries I might never have carried, the sleepless nights I might have avoided." The young monk listened carefully. And now, the old man reached down and picked up a smooth stone resting near his feet. He turned it slowly in his hands. This stone became smooth because of every season. The gentle days, the violent storms, the quiet winters, the rushing floods. He rested the stone in the palm of the young monk's hand. If you removed even one of them, he smiled, it would become a different stone. The young monk nodded thoughtfully. So would I. The old man looked toward the river. So would we all. The breeze moved softly through the willow branches overhead. Several tiny blossoms drifted down, landing upon the surface of the water. Some floated only a few feet before sinking quietly beneath the current. Others continued their gentle journey beneath the moonlight. The old man watched them without sadness. Years earlier, he would have wished to rescue every blossom. Now, he simply appreciated each one while it remained in sight. The young monk looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What is the greatest lesson the river ever taught you?" The old man smiled. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, with eyes still resting upon the flowing water, he answered, "The river never asked me to become fearless." He paused. "It only showed me that fear no longer has to choose the direction of my life." The words settled gently into the cool night air. The young monk closed his eyes. He repeated them silently within his own heart. Neither man noticed how high the moon had climbed. Neither counted the passing hours. Time itself seemed to have relaxed beside the river. At last, the young monk rose and bowed deeply. "Thank you." The old man returned the bow. "Thank the river." The young monk smiled. "I will." He disappeared quietly along the moonlit path toward the temple. The old man remained where he was, listening. breathing, allowing another peaceful night to unfold exactly as it wished. And somehow, that felt like the most faithful prayer he had ever offered. The moon climbed higher above the valley. Its gentle light rested upon the river like a long ribbon of silver stretching toward the unseen sea. The old man remained beneath the willow tree. He no longer felt the need to hurry home. Some evenings ask us to leave. Others quietly invite us to stay. This was one of those evenings. A cool breeze touched his face. The air carried the fragrance of cedar, damp earth, and blossoms that had opened only after sunset. Somewhere nearby, crickets sang their patient evening song. Farther away, an owl called once before the valley returned to its peaceful silence. The old man closed his eyes. His breathing became slow, natural, without effort. As he listened to the river, memories began arriving. Not all at once. One gentle memory after another. The frightened little boy standing beside his father. The first great storm. The wall of stones he believed would protect the valley forever. The sleepless nights. The broken barrier. The old fisherman. The shepherd. The carpenter. His mother. His father. His grandmother. The traveler. The old woman with the wooden cup. The monk upon the temple steps. Every face appeared for only a moment before quietly drifting away like lanterns upon the current. For the first time, he did not wish to return to any of those moments. He did not wish to change a single word. Not because every memory was joyful, because every memory had become part of the river that carried him here. A single tear slipped gently down his cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, nor even of happiness. It was gratitude, pure and quiet. He whispered softly into the night, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, perhaps to everyone, perhaps to life itself. The river answered in the only way it knew, by continuing to flow. The old man smiled. How many years had he waited for the river to speak? How many years had he believed the lesson would arrive as words? Now he understood. The river had been answering him since the very beginning. Every sunrise, every storm, every fallen leaf, every quiet morning, every season had spoken the same gentle truth. Nothing lasts forever, and because of that, everything is precious. He opened his eyes once more. The stars stretched across the sky without number. The river reflected only a few of them, yet the stars it could not hold were no less beautiful. The old man rested one hand upon the cool earth beside him. He felt completely at home, not because life had become predictable, not because every question had found an answer, but because he no longer needed either of those things to belong. The valley breathed peacefully around him. The river flowed peacefully beside him, and his own heart, at long last, flowed peacefully within him. As the night grew deeper, the valley seemed to breathe more slowly. The wind softened. The river lowered its voice until it became little more than a gentle whisper moving through the darkness. The old man rested comfortably beneath the willow tree, looking up at the stars. He no longer tried to count them. Some things become more beautiful the moment we stop measuring them. A shooting star crossed the sky. It appeared for only a heartbeat. Then it was gone. Years ago, he might have wished it had stayed longer. Tonight, he simply smiled because he had been there to see it. A fox wandered quietly to the river's edge for a drink. It paused when it noticed the old man. For a brief moment, they looked at one another. Neither was afraid. Neither felt the need to move. After taking a few calm sips of water, the little animal disappeared silently into the trees. The old man watched until the forest welcomed it home. He thought about all the years he had spent believing that peace was something waiting somewhere in the future. Just one more repair, one more careful plan, one more problem solved. Then, surely, life would finally become calm. He laughed softly. The river had smiled at that idea all along. Peace had never been waiting at the end of his journey. It had been walking beside him through every step, patiently, quietly, waiting for him to notice. The temple bell sounded once in the distance. Its gentle tone drifted across the sleeping valley before fading into silence. The old man folded his hands loosely in his lap. He closed his eyes. His breathing rose and fell with the same unhurried rhythm as the flowing water nearby. Perhaps someone watching from afar would have thought he was meditating. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he was simply resting inside the life he had once tried so desperately to improve. Clouds drifted slowly across the face of the moon. For a few moments, darkness covered the valley. Then the moon appeared again. Nothing had been lost. It had only been hidden for a little while. The old man smiled. Joy was often like that. So was hope. So was trust. Even when we could no longer see them, they continued, shining quietly behind the passing clouds. He opened his eyes one last time. The river still flowed. The stars still watched over the valley. The willow tree still whispered above him. Everything was exactly where it needed to be, including him. He leaned gently against the old tree. Its trunk felt warm from the memory of the day's sunlight. The steady rhythm of the river became softer and softer until it seemed almost impossible to tell where the sound of the water ended, and the quiet peace within his own heart began. The first light of dawn had not yet reached the valley. The world rested in that quiet hour when night has not completely departed, and morning has not yet arrived. The old man remained beneath the willow tree. He had dozed peacefully for a little while, wrapped in the gentle sounds of the river and the comforting embrace of the cool night air. When he slowly opened his eyes, the stars were beginning to fade, not because they had disappeared, because the coming light no longer needed them to show the way. He smiled at the thought. Perhaps wisdom was much the same. There comes a time when we stop searching for it, because it has quietly become the way we live. He rose carefully to his feet. His movements were slow, steady, full of gratitude. He placed one hand upon the old willow tree. Its bark felt familiar beneath his fingers. So many years. He whispered. The tree offered no reply. It never had. Yet somehow, he had always felt understood in its presence. He walked toward the edge of the river. The water reflected the faint silver glow that lingered before sunrise. He bent down and cupped a little of the cool water in his hands. For a moment, he simply held it. Then he opened his fingers. The water slipped gently back into the river. Never truly his, never truly lost, just returning to where it had always belonged. He watched the ripples spread quietly across the surface, then disappear. He thought of his parents, his grandmother, the old fisherman, the shepherd, the carpenter, the traveler, the old woman with the wooden cup, the monk. Every one of them had placed a small stone of wisdom into his life. None of them had asked him to become someone else. They had simply trusted that, one day, the river inside him would carry those lessons where they needed to go. They had been right. The eastern sky slowly brightened. The first birds welcomed another ordinary morning. The old man breathed deeply. How extraordinary, he thought, that an ordinary morning could feel so sacred. He turned once more toward the village. Smoke would soon rise from the chimneys. Children would soon begin laughing. Farmers would greet one another as they walked toward the fields. The river would continue flowing exactly as it always had. Life would begin again, not because yesterday had been forgotten, but because life itself had never stopped moving. The old man smiled. He no longer wished for life to be easier. He no longer wished for storms never to come. He wished for only one thing, that every heart searching for peace might someday discover what the river had patiently been teaching all along. The sun rose gently above the mountains, touching the valley with the first warm light of a brand new day. Golden rays slipped across the quiet river. They rested upon the willow tree, upon the rooftops of the little village, upon every path, every field, every stone that had witnessed the passing of so many seasons. The old man stood for a few moments, letting the morning light warm his face. Then he smiled, not because every question had finally been answered, not because life had become free of change, simply because he was here, breathing, listening, belonging. He took one slow step toward the village, then another. Behind him, the river continued its endless journey toward the sea. It did not ask anyone to follow. It did not ask anyone to understand. It simply flowed, as life has always flowed, as time has always flowed, as every heart, sooner or later, learns to flow. Perhaps that is why rivers have comforted people for thousands of years. They never promise that storms will not come. They simply remind us that no storm has ever convinced a river to stop becoming a river. And perhaps no sorrow has ever truly prevented a gentle heart from becoming itself. If, somewhere in your own life, you have been carrying a burden that feels too heavy, if you have spent countless nights trying to control what tomorrow might bring, may you remember this quiet valley. May you remember the frightened little boy who believed love meant holding back the river. And may you remember the peaceful old man who finally discovered that love sometimes means standing beside the river, trusting its journey, while continuing to walk your own. Tonight, as the stars once again find their places above the world, and as your own breathing becomes a little slower, perhaps you can allow yourself to set down, if only for this evening, one unnecessary worry, one impossible expectation, one burden that was never truly yours to carry. Let the river hold it for a while. It has been carrying mountains for a very long time. Close your eyes whenever they become heavy. Listen to the quiet rhythm of your own breath. Notice how each inhale arrives without being forced. Notice how each exhale leaves without asking permission. Life has been doing this for you since the day you were born. It has never forgotten. And perhaps, just perhaps, you do not have to remember every answer tonight. You only have to remember that you are already part of the same gentle current that carries rivers, seasons, stars, and every living heart toward home. Sleep peacefully, dear friend. The river will keep flowing until morning, and so will hope.